The story of the Mexico people begins in the shadowy realm between myth and history in a place called Allen, whose very name would later give rise to the term Aztec. According to the codices and oral traditions preserved by indigenous chroniclers, Allen existed as an island paradise somewhere in northwestern Mexico, possibly in the modern-day states of Nayarit or Koloa. Archaeological evidence suggests this homeland may have been located near lagoons or marshlands, as the Mexico retained throughout their history a profound understanding of lustrine agriculture and water management systems that could only have been developed over generations of practice. The divine mandate that would drive the Mexica from their ancestral home came through their patron deity Pakli, the hummingbird god of war and the sun. According to the Mexico creation narrative recorded in sources like the Alban Codex and the Chronicles of Fernando Alvarado, Tuzlapachli appeared to the tribal priests and commanded them to abandon Allen. The god promised to lead them to a new homeland where they would become the rulers of all they surveyed. But first, they must endure a period of wandering that would test their faith and forge them into a people worthy of greatness. This divine prophecy established the religious foundation for what would become one of history's most significant migrations. As the Mexica understood their journey, not merely as a search for better lands, but as a sacred quest ordained by their gods. The migration began sometime in the 12th century AD, most likely around 1111 or 1168, according to different chronological interpretations of the indigenous sources. The Mexico departed Allen as one of several Nahuatl-speaking groups, collectively known as the Chichimeca, who were leaving the northern regions of Mesoamerica during this period. Climate change, population pressure, and political upheaval in the north likely contributed to these mass movements. Though the Mexica themselves emphasized a religious imperative above all other factors, their journey southward took them through the rugged terrain of western Mexico, following ancient trade routes that connected the northern frontier with the civilized heartland of central Mexico. The migrating band consisted of several hundred individuals organized into calpulli, kinship-based units that served as the basic building blocks of Mexico's society. Each calpulli maintained its own identity and leadership while acknowledging the overall authority of the tribal council and the priests who carried the sacred bundle containing the image of Huitzilopochtli. The Mexican migration was not a direct march, but rather series of temporary settlements interspersed with periods of movement. They would establish camps for months or even years at locations that provided adequate resources, particularly water and arable land. During these stops, they practiced their traditional combination of hunting, gathering, and small-scale agriculture, growing maize, beans, and squash wherever conditions permitted. The portable nature of their material culture during this period reflects their nomadic lifestyle. They carried few possessions beyond essential tools, weapons, and religious artifacts. As the Mexico moved deeper into central Mexico, they encountered increasingly sophisticated civilizations. The Valley of Mexico in the 13th and 14th centuries was dominated by several powerful city-states, including Culhuacan, Azcapotzalco, Salco, Tex, Coco, and Chalco. These urban centers controlled extensive territories and commanded the loyalty of numerous smaller settlements. The valley's population was ethnically diverse, with Nahuatl speakers comprising the majority, but significant communities of Adamitin and other groups maintaining their distinct identities. The established powers initially viewed the Mexico as just another group of Chicha barbarians from the north. The term Chichimea, meaning dog people, was used somewhat derogatorily by the sedentary populations to describe the semi-nomadic groups that periodically entered the valley. However, the Mexica possessed certain advantages that distinguished them from other migrant bands. They were skilled warriors, having honed their military capabilities during their long journey through hostile territory. They also demonstrated remarkable adaptability, quickly learning the political dynamics of the valley and positioning themselves as valuable allies rather than mere raiders. The city-state of Culhuacan became Mexico's first significant patron in the valley. Culhuacan claimed direct descent from the ancient Toltecs and maintained considerable prestige despite its declining military power. The Cura rulers recognized the martial prowess of the Mexica and employed them as mercenaries in their conflicts with neighboring city-states. This arrangement provided the Mexico with their first stable base in the valley while allowing them to gain intimate knowledge of local warfare, politics, and culture. During their service to Culhuacan, the Mexica demonstrated their effectiveness in several military campaigns. They fought against the Yaximilca, inhabitants of the Chinampas in the southern part of Lake Zutilo, and proved themselves capable of adapting their fighting techniques to the unique environment of the valley's lake system. The Mexico warriors learned to use canoes effectively in combat and developed tactics for fighting in the marshy terrain that surrounded the lakes. The relationship between the Mexico and Culhuacan eventually soured due to cultural and political tensions. The Mexica maintained religious practices that the more sophisticated Culhura found barbaric, including forms of human sacrifice that exceeded even the norms of Mesoamerican ritual violence. Additionally, the Mexica's growing confidence and assertiveness began to concern their patrons, who recognized that their mercenaries might eventually become competitors rather than subordinates. Following their departure from Culhuacan, the Mexica sought employment with Azcapotzalco, the most powerful city-state in the Western Valley. The teen rulers of Azcapotzalco controlled extensive tribute networks and commanded the largest military forces in the region. They welcomed the Mexica's auxiliary troops, particularly valuing their skills in long-distance warfare and their willingness to undertake dangerous missions that established warriors might avoid. Under teen patronage, the Mexica participated in campaigns throughout the valley and beyond. They fought against the city-states of Texcoco across the lake, helped suppress rebellions in tributary communities, and served as shock troops in major battles. These military experiences provided the Mexico with comprehensive knowledge of the valley's geography, resources, and political weaknesses. They learned which communities were prosperous, which trade routes were most valuable, and which alliances were fragile enough to be exploited. The Mexica's reputation as fierce warriors grew during this period, but they remained fundamentally dependent on their patrons for land and resources. They lived in temporary settlements on the margins of established territories, always subject to displacement if their services were no longer required. This precarious situation motivated their leaders to seek a permanent homeland where they could establish their own city-state and control their own destiny. The divine sign that would end their wandering came in the form of a vision that fulfilled Pochi's ancient prophecy. According to Mexico tradition, their priest received a revelation directing them to seek a specific location where they would witness an eagle perched on a Nepal cactus devouring a serpent. This image, which would later become the central symbol of Mexican national identity, represented the cosmic balance between opposing forces and the triumph of the solar deity over the powers of the earth. The search for this prophetic sign led to Mexico to the marshy islands and reeds of Lake Texcoco in the heart of the valley. The lake system was already densely populated around its shores, but the small islands and swampy areas in the interior remained largely unused by the established city-states. These wetlands were considered marginal lands, suitable perhaps for hunting waterfowl or gathering reeds, but hardly the foundation for a major settlement. When the Mexico scouts finally located the prophetic eagle on a small island in the lake, the practical challenges of establishing a settlement there must have seemed overwhelming. The island was barely above water level during the rainy season, lacked freshwater sources, and provided no natural building materials beyond mud and reeds. However, the religious significance of the site outweighed all practical considerations. The priests declared that Huitzilopochtli had chosen this place as the center of their future empire, and the people accepted this divine judgment without question. The initial settlement on the island was modest in the extreme. The first structures were simple huts built on raised platforms to protect them from seasonal flooding. The Mexica constructed these early buildings using techniques learned during their nomadic period, weaving walls from reeds and covering them with mud plaster. The roofs were thatched with lake grasses, and the floors were made of packed earth mixed with crushed shells and pottery shards to provide drainage. Fresh water presented an immediate and ongoing challenge. The lake water was brackish and unsuitable for drinking, forcing the settlers to develop ingenious solutions. They dug shallow wells that tapped into underground freshwater springs, and they constructed elaborate systems of channels and reservoirs to collect and store rainwater. The management of water resources became a central preoccupation that would later evolve into the sophisticated hydraulic engineering for which the Aztec capital would become famous. Food production on the island required the development of entirely new agricultural techniques. The Mexico could not simply transplant their traditional farming methods to this aquatic environment. Instead, they began experimenting with chinampers, artificial islands created by piling up mud, lake sediment, and organic matter in shallow areas of the lake. These floating gardens, anchored in place by willow trees whose roots grew down into the lake bottom, provided highly fertile plots for growing crops. The early champers were small and crude compared to the elaborate systems that would later surround the Aztec capital. The first settlers learned through trial and error which crops grew best in the unique conditions of the lake environment, how to manage water levels to prevent flooding or drought, and how to maintain the structural integrity of their artificial islands against the constant erosion of wind and waves. The Mexico's transition from nomadic mercenaries to settled agriculturalists was neither smooth nor immediate. Many aspects of their traditional culture had to be adapted or abandoned entirely. The portable material culture of their wandering years gave way to more substantial possessions that reflected their permanent settlement. They began producing larger quantities of pottery, developing new styles that reflected their unique environment and experiences. The social organization of the community also evolved during this period. The Calpulli system that had served them well during their migration was modified to accommodate the realities of settled life. Each kinship group was assigned specific areas of the island for their residences and was given responsibility for particular aspects of community life, such as maintaining sections of the Chinamp system, organizing religious ceremonies, or providing warriors for the community's defense. The early decades of the settlement were marked by constant struggles for survival and recognition. The established powers of the valley initially viewed the Mexico island community as an insignificant curiosity hardly worth their attention. This neglect was actually beneficial in many ways, as it allowed the Mexica to develop their unique adaptations to the lake environment without interference from more powerful neighbors. However, isolation also meant vulnerability. The Mexica had to develop their own defense capabilities without the protection of a powerful patron. They constructed fortifications around their settlement, using the natural barriers of the lake to their advantage, while building artificial defenses to protect against amphibious attacks. The community's warriors maintained their skills through constant training and occasional raids against hostile neighbors, gradually building a reputation for military effectiveness that would serve them well in future conflicts. The religious life of the community centered around the worship of Huitzilopochtli, whose guidance had brought them to their new home. The first temple on the island was a modest structure, but it served as the focal point for the elaborate ceremonies that reinforced community identity and divine favor. The priest maintained the sacred calendar, organized the ritual observances that marked the agricultural cycle, and preserved the historical traditions that connected the community to its mythical origins in Allen. The transformation of the modest Mexico settlement into the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan began in earnest around 1325 AD when the community's leaders made the momentous decision to establish their permanent capital on the island where their scouts had witnessed the prophetic eagle. The date itself carries significance in Mexico chronology, corresponding to the year 2 house in their calendar system, which was considered auspicious for new beginnings and the establishment of lasting institutions. The initial phase of urban development required the Mexico to overcome seemingly insurmountable geographical challenges. The island occupied barely 2 square kilometers of marshy land that rose only slightly above the lake surface during the dry season and was frequently inundated during the annual rains. The surrounding waters of Lake Texcoco contain high concentrations of salt and mineral deposits, making them unsuitable for drinking or irrigation. The nearest sources of building stone lay dozens of kilometers away on the valley's rim, accessible only by canoe transport across open water that could become treacherous during storms. Despite these obstacles, the Mexico possessed certain advantages that their neighbors had overlooked. Their decades of migration had taught them to adapt quickly to new environments and to extract maximum benefit from marginal resources. Their experience as mercenaries had provided them with detailed knowledge of the valley's political geography, trade networks, and military capabilities. Most importantly, their religious conviction that Huitzilopochtli had chosen this site gave them the determination to persist through the inevitable hardships of the early settlement period. The expansion of Tenochtitlan beyond its original boundaries required the systematic development of Chinampas, the artificial island agricultural system that would become one of the most sophisticated farming innovations in human history. The early Chinampas built during the settlement's first decades were crude affairs, consisting of rectangular plots measuring roughly 30x 2.5 and created by piling lake mud and organic debris within frameworks of woven reeds. The Mexico learned through experimentation that the key to successful Chinampa construction lay in achieving the proper balance of materials and drainage. The foundation of each Chinampa began with the careful selection of a suitable location in the shallow areas of the lake where the water depth ranged from 1 to 3 m. Workers would drive stakes made from Ayue willow wood into the lake bottom to mark the boundaries of the plant plot. Between these stakes, there were walls of reeds and marsh grasses, creating a rectangular enclosure that would contain the fill material. The bottom layer consisted of thick mats of aquatic vegetation, particularly the abundant water hyaen that grew throughout the lake system. Upon this organic foundation, the builders added alternating layers of lake mud and decomposed plant matter, carefully compacting each layer to prevent settling and erosion. The mud was extracted from specific areas of the lake bottom where centuries of sediment deposition had created deep, fertile deposits rich in nutrients. Teams of workers using wooden scoops and baskets would dive repeatedly to bring up this precious material, a backbreaking process that required exceptional physical endurance and swimming ability. The most crucial aspect of Chinampa construction involved the planting of Hewitt willows along the perimeter of each artificial island. These fast-growing trees served multiple functions. Their extensive root systems anchored the shenanigans against erosion and wave action. Their branches provided materials for tools and construction, and their foliage created windbreaks that protected crops from the strong winds that swept across the open lake. The willows were planted as cutings in the freshly constructed Chinampas, and within 2 to 3 years, they had developed sufficient root mass to stabilize the artificial islands permanently. The agricultural potential of the Chinamp system exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of its creators. The combination of rich lake sediments, constant moisture, and protection from frost created growing conditions that supported multiple harvests per year. Maize, the staple crop of Mesoamerican civilization, thrived in the Chinampa environment, producing yields that were 3 to 4 times higher than those achieved on traditional dryland farms. Beans and squash, the other components of the classic Mesoamerican agricultural trinity, grew equally well in the artificial islands. The Mexica also discovered that bananas were ideally suited for growing specialty crops that commanded high prices in regional markets. Tomatoes, chili peppers, and various flowering plants flourished in the controlled environment of the floating gardens. The flowers were particularly important for religious ceremonies and were in constant demand throughout the valley. Amaranth, a highly nutritious grain that could be processed into ceremonial sculptures, became another valuable chin crop that helped establish Tenochtitlan's reputation as a center of religious innovation. The success of the Chinamp system enabled rapid population growth in the early decades of Tenochtitlan's existence. Families that had struggled to feed themselves during the nomadic period now found themselves producing agricultural surpluses that could be traded for manufactured goods, raw materials, and luxury items. The increased food security attracted additional settlers, including skilled craftsmen and specialists who recognized the economic opportunities offered by the growing community. Simultaneously with the development of Tenochtitlan, another Mexican settlement was taking shape on a nearby island in Lake Texcoco. Tlatelolco, whose name means place of the round earth mound, was founded by a related group of Mexico who had separated from the main body during the final phase of the migration. According to the indigenous chronicles, this division occurred as a result of internal disputes over leadership and religious practices. Though the exact nature of these disagreements remains unclear from the surviving sources, the founders of Tlatelolco established their settlement approximately 3 kilometers north of Tenochtitlan on an island that offered certain advantages over the site chosen by their kinsmen. Tlatelolco's island was slightly larger and higher above the water level, providing more space for initial construction and better protection against seasonal flooding. The surrounding waters were also somewhat less saline, making the development of freshwater sources easier to achieve. Despite their political separation, the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan and Plateau maintained close cultural and economic ties. Both communities spoke the same dialect of Nahuatl, worshipped the same pantheon of deities, and shared virtually identical social institutions. Intermarriage between the two settlements was common, creating kinship networks that transcended political boundaries. The proximity of the two islands facilitated constant communication and cooperation in matters of mutual interest, particularly defense against external threats and the management of shared resources in the lake environment. The economic relationship between Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco developed along complementary lines that reflected the different strengths and priorities of each community. Tenochtitlan's leaders focused primarily on military expansion and political alliance building activities that required significant investments in weapons, warrior training, and diplomatic gifts. Tlatelolco's rulers, by contrast, concentrated on developing their settlement as a commercial center that could serve the growing trade networks of the valley. Tlatelolco's strategic location made it an ideal hub for merchants traveling between the various city-states around Lake Texcoco. The settlement's harbors could accommodate the large cargo canoes that transported bulk goods across the lake, while its markets provided secure venues for the exchange of valuable merchandise. Plato's merchants, known as Pachica, developed extensive trade relationships that extended far beyond the valley, reaching into the tropical lands of the Gulf Coast and the Pacific coastal regions. The Poctec of Plata were more than simple traders. They served as intelligence agents, diplomats, and cultural ambassadors for the Mexican people. Their commercial expeditions provided detailed information about distant regions, their resources, their political organization, and their military capabilities. This intelligence proved invaluable to the rulers of both Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco as they planned their strategies for expansion and conquest. The growing prosperity of both settlements created the need for improved transportation infrastructure. The original inhabitants had relied on simple dugout canoes for movement between their islands and the mainland. But the increasing volume of people and goods required more sophisticated solutions. The construction of causeways connecting the island settlements to the mainland became one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the early period. The first causeway linked Tenochtitlan to the western shore of the lake, providing direct access to the territories controlled by Azcapotzalco, the Mexica's teen patrons. This causeway stretched approximately 8 kilometers across the shallow waters of the lake, requiring the construction of thousands of wooden pilings to support the roadway. The pilings were driven deep into the lake bottom using wooden hammers operated by teams of workers standing on floating platforms. Once the pilings were in place, horizontal beams were lashed to them with rope made from maguey fibers, creating a framework that could support the weight of the roadway. The roadway itself consisted of a thick layer of stones and packed earth raised approximately 1 meter above the normal water level to prevent flooding during storms. At regular intervals, the causeway was interrupted by removable wooden bridges that could be withdrawn in case of attack, transforming the roadway into a defensive barrier that would trap enemies on the islands. These bridges also allowed canoe traffic to pass beneath the causeway, maintaining the free flow of commerce that was essential to the lake's economy. The construction of the Western Causeway required unprecedented cooperation between Tenochtitlan and its neighbors. The teen rulers of Azcapotzalco provided much of the stone and timber needed for the project, while tributary communities supplied the massive labor force required for the construction work. The project took several years to complete and represented a significant investment of resources by all parties involved. Additional causeways followed in subsequent decades, connecting Tenochtitlan to the northern and southern shores of the lake. Each causeway incorporated lessons learned from previous construction projects, resulting in increasingly sophisticated engineering solutions. The Northern Causeway featured a more elaborate system of bridges and included raised sections that provided panoramic views of the surrounding lake system. The Southern Causeway incorporated a sophisticated aqueduct that brought fresh water from springs on the mainland to the growing population of the island city. The development of the causeway system transformed Tenochtitlan from an isolated island settlement into the hub of a regional transportation network. Merchants, pilgrims, and officials from throughout the valley could now reach the Mexican capital directly without the delays and risks associated with water transport. The increased accessibility attracted additional settlers and stimulated economic growth that funded further urban development projects. Parallel to the construction of the causeways, the Mexico engineers developed an intricate system of canals that served multiple functions within the growing city. The primary canals followed the natural contours of the island, providing navigable waterways that allowed cargo canoes to reach markets and residential areas throughout the settlement. Secondary canals served as drainage channels that carried away excess water during the rainy season, preventing the flooding that had plagued the early settlement. The canal system also incorporated sophisticated hydraulic features that regulated water levels throughout the city. Wooden slee gates controlled the flow of water between different sections of the canal network, allowing engineers to direct water where it was needed most urgently. During dry periods, the gates could be adjusted to conserve water in residential areas and chinamper zones. During floods, the same gates could be opened to channel excess water safely out of the city. The urban planning of Tenochtitlan reflected a careful balance between practical necessity and religious symbolism. The city was organized around a central ceremonial precinct that housed the most important temples and government buildings. This sacred center was aligned with the cardinal directions according to Mesoamerican cosmological principles, with the main temple pyramid facing west toward the setting sun. The ceremonial precinct was surrounded by concentric zones of residential neighborhoods, markets, and specialized craft workshops, each with its own internal organization and leadership structure. The residential areas were organized according to the traditional Calpulli system, with each kinship group occupying a distinct neighborhood that included houses, gardens, and small temples dedicated to the group's patron deities. The houses themselves were built using techniques adapted to the unique environment of the lake city. The foundations consisted of wooden platforms raised above the normal water level and anchored to pilings driven into the island's substrate. The walls were constructed using a combination of stone, adobe bricks, and wooden frames, depending on the availability of materials and the wealth of the occupants. The establishment of formal political institutions accompanied the physical development of Tenochtitlan. The position of Heur Tadawani, or Great Speaker, emerged as the supreme authority in the growing city-state. The first individual to hold this title was Tenoch, the legendary leader whose name became incorporated into the city's official designation as Tenochtitlan, meaning place of Tenno. Historical sources provide limited information about Teno's actual reign, but later traditions credited him with establishing many of the fundamental institutions that would govern society for centuries. The Huey Platawani served as both secular ruler and high priest, embodying the unity of political and religious authority that characterized Mesoamerican kingship. The ruler's responsibilities included leading the community in warfare, overseeing the distribution of land and resources, conducting the most important religious ceremonies, and serving as the final arbiter in legal disputes. The position was theoretically elective, with the ruler chosen by a council of nobles from among the eligible members of the royal lineage, though in practice the succession often followed hereditary patterns. Supporting the Huey Platawani was a complex bureaucracy that managed the various aspects of city administration. The Kawal, or woman serpent, served as the ruler's principal deputy and handled many of the day-to-day administrative responsibilities. Military affairs were overseen by specialized war leaders who commanded the various warrior societies that formed the backbone of Mexico military power. Religious activities were coordinated by a hierarchy of priests who maintained the elaborate ceremonial calendar and conducted the rituals essential to the community's spiritual well-being. The codification of Mexico religious practices during this period established the theological foundation for the empire that would eventually emerge. The pantheon of deities worshipped in Tenochtitlan reflected the community's diverse cultural heritage, incorporating elements from their nomadic traditions, their experiences as mercenaries, and their interactions with the sophisticated civilizations of central Mexico. Huitzilopochtli remained the paramount deity, but he was joined by numerous other gods and goddesses who governed specific aspects of life in the lake city. The religious calendar that governed ritual activities in Tenochtitlan was based on the complex interaction of two separate counting systems: the 260-day Tonopali, or sacred calendar, and the 365-day Superali, or solar calendar. The combination of these two calendars created a 52-year cycle that served as the fundamental unit for measuring longer periods of time. The completion of each 52-year cycle was marked by elaborate ceremonies that included the ritual destruction of household goods and the rekindling of sacred fires throughout the city. The social hierarchy that emerged in early Tenochtitlan reflected both traditional Mexico values and adaptations to their new urban environment. At the apex of society stood the Pipilan, the noble class that included the royal family, high-ranking warriors, and senior priests. The Pipilan controlled most of the city's wealth and held the majority of important political and religious offices. Their children received specialized education in schools called Calmac, where they learned the complex skills required for leadership in Mexico society. The Maqualan, or commoners, comprised a majority of Tenochtitlan's population and included farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and laborers. While they lacked the political privileges of the nobility, the Muletin enjoyed considerable social mobility through military service, commercial success, or religious devotion. Exceptional warriors could earn noble status through their battlefield achievements, while successful merchants could accumulate wealth that rivaled that of hereditary nobles. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the Klakin, individuals who had been enslaved through warfare, debt, or criminal conviction. Slavery in Mexico society differed significantly from the plantation systems that would later develop in other parts of the Americas. Slaves retained certain legal rights, could own property, and could potentially earn or purchase their freedom. Many slaves worked as domestic servants in noble households, while others labored in the shenanigans or served in religious capacities. The death of Kaimalpapa, the third ruler of Tenochtitlan in 1427 AD, marked a pivotal moment that would transform the Mexico from tributary subjects into the dominant power of central Mexico. Chimalpopoca's assassination, orchestrated by Maxler, the ambitious new ruler of Azcapotzalco, represented the culmination of growing tensions between the teen empire and its increasingly assertive Mexican vassals. The young Tenochtitlan ruler had been strangled in his palace during what appeared to be a diplomatic meeting, a betrayal that shocked the Mexican nobility and provided the catalyst for revolutionary change. The succession crisis that followed Kaimalpa's murder revealed deep divisions within Mexico society about how to respond to teen aggression. Conservative nobles favored maintaining the tributary relationship with the capital, arguing that open rebellion would result in the destruction of their still vulnerable island city. They pointed to the overwhelming military superiority of the Aztec Empire, which controlled most of the western and northern shores of Lake Texcoco and commanded tribute from dozens of subordinate communities. The prospect of facing Maxella's armies without powerful allies seemed suicidal to these cautious voices. However, a faction led by its coadal, Chimalpopoca's uncle, and a seasoned military commander advocated for armed resistance. Its coadal had spent decades observing the internal weaknesses of the Aztec Empire during his service as a war leader under previous rulers. He recognized that Maxler's aggressive policies had created widespread resentment among many of Azcapotzalco's tributaries, particularly the powerful city-state of Texcoco, which had recently been conquered and humiliated by teen forces. The death of Nezahualcóyotl's father, Islit, the legitimate ruler of Texcoco at teen hands, had created a potential ally whose desire for revenge matched that of the Mexica. Its coadal's election as the new Hui Tlatoani represented a decisive rejection of accommodation with Azcapotzalco. The new ruler was approximately 50 years old at the time of his accession, a mature leader whose military experience and political acumen had earned him respect throughout Mexico society. Unlike his predecessors who had risen to power during periods of relative stability, its coadal faced immediate existential threats that required bold action and innovative solutions. His first priority was to forge alliances that could counterbalance teen military superiority. The most crucial of these diplomatic initiatives involved secret negotiations with Nezahualcóyotl, the exiled prince of Texcoco, who had been living as a fugitive since his father's death. Nezahualcóyotl possessed intimate knowledge of teen military capabilities and political vulnerabilities, having spent years planning his campaign to reclaim his ancestral throne. The young prince had already begun organizing resistance networks among the communities of the eastern lakeshore, many of which had chafed under teen domination and yearned for the restoration of Texcoco's traditional hegemony over the region. The alliance between its coadal and Nezahualcóyotl was formalized through a series of clandestine meetings held on small islands in the northern part of Lake Texcoco. These negotiations required extraordinary secrecy, as Maxler had placed substantial bounties on both leaders and maintained an extensive network of spies throughout the valley. The two rulers communicated through trusted intermediaries who used coded messages and traveled by night in unmarked canoes to avoid detection by teen patrols. The third member of what would become the Triple Alliance was Tutawasti, the ruler of Tacloban, a smaller city-state located on the western shore of the lake. Tacloban's inclusion in the alliance reflected both strategic necessity and political calculation. The city controlled important trade routes between the valley and the regions to the west, and its cooperation was essential for maintaining supply lines during the anticipated conflict with Azcapotzalco. Additionally, Tukius commanded significant military forces and possessed detailed knowledge of team defensive preparations, having served as one of Maxler's subordinate commanders before secretly defecting to the rebel cause. The formal establishment of the Triple Alliance, known in New Adel as the Xanten Platoon or Three Speakers, occurred in 1428 AD through elaborate ceremonies that invoked ancient Mesoamerican traditions of confederation. The three rulers met at a neutral location on the lake and participated in ritual bloodletting that symbolically bound their lineages together in perpetual alliance. Each leader contributed drops of blood to a sacred fire, while priests chanted invocations to the gods requesting divine approval for their confederation. The terms of the alliance were carefully negotiated to reflect the relative contributions and capabilities of each partner. Tenochtitlan, as the initiator of the rebellion and the largest contributor of military forces, was accorded the dominant position within the Confederation. The Mexican ruler would serve as the supreme military commander during joint campaigns and would receive the largest share of tribute from conquered territories. Texcoco, in recognition of Nezahualcóyotl's political legitimacy and administrative expertise, was granted authority over the eastern regions of the valley and responsibility for managing the alliance's legal and bureaucratic affairs. Tlacopan, though the smallest of the three partners, received control over western territories and a guaranteed portion of tribute revenues. The division of tribute within the alliance followed a carefully calculated formula that would persist throughout the empire's existence. Tenochtitlan claimed 2/5 of all tribute collected from conquered territories, reflecting its position as the senior partner and primary military contributor. Texcoco received 2/5 as well, acknowledging its crucial role in the alliance and its control over the populous eastern regions. Tlacopan received the remaining 1/5, a proportion that recognized its smaller size while ensuring its continued loyalty to the Confederation. The military preparations for the war against its capital required unprecedented coordination among the three allied city-states. Each partner contributed specialized capabilities that complemented those of the others. Tenochtitlan provided the largest contingent of infantry warriors drawn from its expanding population of Mesoamerica who had been trained in the traditional Mexico warrior societies. These soldiers were organized into units based on their Calpulli affiliations and were equipped with obsidian clubs, spears, and shields decorated with distinctive designs that identified their origins. Texcoco's military contribution focused on elite warrior units and specialized siege equipment. Nezahualcóyotl had spent his years in exile, studying the military innovations of various Mesoamerican cultures, and he introduced new tactical concepts that enhanced the alliance's effectiveness. Texcocan engineers constructed portable bridges that allowed rapid river crossings and developed new types of projectile weapons that could breach the wooden palisades protecting Tannic strongholds. Tlacopan's forces were particularly valuable for their knowledge of local terrain and their expertise in amphibious operations. The city's warriors were skilled in the use of war canoes and could conduct coordinated attacks on lakefront positions that were inaccessible to conventional infantry forces. They also provided crucial intelligence about team defensive preparations and supply routes. Having maintained extensive contacts within Azcapotzalco's military hierarchy, the role of Tlacopan, its Kettle's nephew and principal advisor, proved crucial in transforming these military preparations into a comprehensive strategy for imperial expansion. Tlal held the position of Chihuahuacoatl, or Woman Serpent, which made him the second-ranking official in the Mexican government and its coat's designated successor in administrative matters. Unlike previous holders of this office who had focused primarily on internal governance, CLLL envisioned a radical restructuring of Mexico society to support sustained military expansion and imperial administration. Tlaxcal's reforms began with the reorganization of Mexican military institutions to create a more professional and effective fighting force. The traditional warrior societies, which had been primarily social and religious organizations, were transformed into disciplined military units with standardized training equipment and command structures. Young men were required to undergo rigorous physical conditioning and combat training from an early age, with advancement through the warrior hierarchy dependent on demonstrated battlefield prowess. The most significant of Cleel's military innovations was the institutionalization of the Flowery Wars. Ritualized conflicts designed to provide opportunities for warriors to capture enemies for sacrifice while avoiding the complete destruction of potential tributary states. These carefully regulated battles served multiple purposes. They maintained the fighting skills of Mexico warriors during peacetime, provided a steady supply of sacrificial victims for religious ceremonies, and demonstrated Mexican military superiority to potential enemies without the costs associated with total warfare. Religious reforms accompanied these military changes as Tale sought to create an ideological foundation for Mexican imperial ambitions. The cult of Huitzilopochtli was elevated above all other deities in the Mexican pantheon, with a war god portrayed as the divine patron of imperial expansion. New myths were created, or existing stories were modified to emphasize Lai's role as the champion of the Mexican people and the divine source of their authority over other nations. The practice of human sacrifice was systematized and expanded under Tale's direction, becoming a central element of state policy rather than merely a religious observance. Large-scale sacrificial ceremonies were organized to coincide with major military campaigns, with hundreds of captive warriors offered to the gods to ensure divine favor for Mexico armies. These spectacular rituals served important political functions, demonstrating Mexico's power to allies and enemies, while reinforcing the religious obligations that bound conquered peoples to their new overlords. The administrative framework that would govern the expanding empire was established during the preparations for the Teen War. Plassel created new governmental positions to handle the complexities of ruling multiple city-states and managing tribute collection from distant territories. Professional administrators drawn from the ranks of the nobility and trained in specialized schools were assigned to oversee conquered regions and ensure compliance with imperial directives. The tribute system itself was standardized according to principles that balanced imperial needs with local capabilities. Each conquered territory was assessed based on its population, agricultural productivity, and access to valuable resources. Tribute obligations were carefully calculated to extract maximum value without destroying local economies or provoking rebellions. Communities that produced agricultural surpluses were required to deliver specified quantities of maize, beans, and other foodstuffs. Regions with access to luxury goods, such as cacao, precious stones, or exotic feathers, were obligated to provide these materials for imperial use. The collection of tribute was organized through a hierarchical system of local officials who reported to imperial administrators. Native rulers who submitted peacefully were often allowed to retain their positions as tributary lords, responsible for gathering the required goods and delivering them to imperial collection centers. This system of indirect rule minimized the administrative burden on the imperial government while maintaining local stability and legitimacy. The war against the Sapidal began in earnest during the dry season of 1428, when the Allied forces launched coordinated attacks against teen strongholds throughout the Western Valley. The initial phase of the campaign focused on isolating Azcapotzalco from its tributary allies by capturing strategic towns that controlled key transportation routes. Mexico forces supported by Texcocan siege specialists systematically reduced teen outposts, while Telecapan warriors disrupted enemy supply lines through amphibious raids. The siege of Azcapotzalco itself lasted for several months and demonstrated the effectiveness of the alliance's coordinated strategy. Mexico infantry surrounded the city's landward approaches, while Texcoan engineers constructed siege works that prevented relief forces from reaching the defenders. Takapan canoes controlled the lake approaches, intercepting supply convoys and preventing the evacuation of Tony leadership. Maxler's death during the final assault on Azcapotzalco marked the end of Tanakh dominance in the Valley of Mexico. The fall of the city was followed by systematic destruction of its temples and administrative buildings, symbolically erasing the political and religious foundations of teen power. The surviving population was relocated to other communities throughout the valley, preventing any future revival of teen independence. The victory over Azcapotzalco transformed the political landscape of central Mexico and established the Triple Alliance as the dominant power in the region. The wealth captured during the conquest funded massive construction projects in all three allied cities, including the expansion of Tenochtitlan's ceremonial center and the construction of new palaces for the victorious rulers. More importantly, the success of the rebellion demonstrated the effectiveness of the alliance's military and administrative innovations, providing a template for future conquests throughout Mesoamerica. The tribute extracted from former Tony territories provided the economic foundation for imperial expansion. The Allied rulers used these resources to maintain larger armies, support specialized craftsmen who produce luxury goods for diplomatic gifts, and fund the administrative apparatus necessary to govern distant provinces. The wealth also enabled significant improvements in agricultural productivity through the expansion of irrigation systems and the construction of additional chinampers in the lake system. The consolidation of Triple Alliance power following the defeat of Azcapotzalco created unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion that the Mexican rulers were quick to exploit. The tribute flowing from former Tony territories provided the economic resources necessary to maintain professional armies, while the alliance's demonstrated military effectiveness attracted additional city-state seeking protection partnership. Within a decade of Maxler's death, the Confederation controlled most of the Valley of Mexico and had begun extending its influence into the surrounding highland regions. Its cattle's death in 1440 brought to power his nephew Moctezuma Iluikamina, known to history as Moctezuma I, whose reign would witness the transformation of the Triple Alliance from a regional confederation into a true empire spanning much of central Mexico. The new Huey Tlatoani was approximately 35 years old at his accession, having spent his youth as a warrior in the campaigns against Azcapotzalco and his early adulthood as a military commander under his uncle's direction. Unlike previous rulers who had inherited relatively stable situations, Moctezuma first faced the challenge of managing an expanding state while simultaneously conducting military campaigns that would extend Mexican influence far beyond the traditional boundaries of central Mexican politics. The administrative system that Moctezuma inherited from his predecessors required significant modifications to accommodate the complexities of governing distant territories inhabited by diverse ethnic groups with varying levels of political sophistication. The tribute collection mechanisms that had proven effective in the Valley of Mexico needed adaptation for regions where different languages were spoken, alternative agricultural systems were practiced, and local political structures bore little resemblance to the city-state organizations familiar to Mexico administrators. Moctem I's first major military campaign targeted the Aztec peoples of the Gulf Coast, a region that had remained largely independent of central Mexican influence. Despite its proximity to the highland valleys, the Azteca, as this territory was known, encompassed the fertile lands stretching from the Sierra Madre Oriental to the Gulf of Mexico, an area characterized by abundant rainfall, rich alluvial soils, and access to valuable resources, including cotton, cacao, and tropical bird feathers prized for ceremonial purposes. The Aztec peoples themselves presented a formidable challenge to Mexico expansion efforts. They had developed sophisticated agricultural systems adapted to their humid environment, constructing elaborate drainage networks that allowed intensive cultivation of maize, beans, and cotton in areas that would otherwise have been too waterlogged for productive farming. Their settlements were typically built on elevated platforms that provided protection from seasonal flooding while facilitating trade along the numerous rivers that crossed the coastal plain. Huasc military organization differed significantly from the warrior society systems familiar to the Mexica. Rather than the hierarchical structures based on individual combat prowess that characterized Highland armies, WATC forces emphasized collective tactics and the coordinated use of projectile weapons. Their warriors were skilled archers who employed powerful composite bows capable of penetrating the cotton armor typically worn by Mesoamerican soldiers. They also made extensive use of poisoned arrows and darts, weapons that were considered dishonorable by Highland standards, but proved devastatingly effective in the dense vegetation of the coastal lowlands. The logistical challenges of conducting military operations in the Deca required innovative solutions for Mexico planners. The tropical climate created health hazards for Highland warriors unaccustomed to high humidity and endemic diseases. The dense forest cover made traditional infantry formations ineffective, while the numerous rivers and swamps hindered the movement of large armies. Supply lines stretching hundreds of kilometers from the Highland valleys were vulnerable to interdiction by hostile forces familiar with local terrain. Moctezuma FS addressed these challenges through a combination of diplomatic preparation and tactical adaptation. Advance agents were sent into Aztec territory months before the main military expedition, establishing relationships with local leaders who might be persuaded to support Mexico objectives in exchange for favorable treatment under the new imperial administration. These diplomatic missions also gathered crucial intelligence about Aztec military capabilities, political divisions, and economic resources that would inform subsequent military planning. The Mexico forces that eventually invaded the Haztecar in 1444 represented a significant departure from traditional Highland military organization. Rather than the massive armies that had proven effective in the Valley of Mexico, Moctezuma deployed smaller, more mobile units capable of operating effectively in the difficult terrain of the coastal lands. These expeditionary forces included specialists trained in jungle warfare, engineers capable of constructing temporary bridges across rivers and swamps, and medical personnel familiar with tropical diseases and their treatment. The campaign itself unfolded over several years as Mexico forces systematically reduced Aztec strongholds while establishing permanent garrisons to secure their conquests. The process required careful attention to local political dynamics, as the Haste was not a unified state, but rather a collection of independent communities with complex relationships of alliance and rivalry. Mexico commanders learned to exploit these divisions, supporting local leaders who were willing to acknowledge imperial authority while isolating and destroying those who insisted on continued independence. The conquest of the Azteca provided the Mexican Empire with access to resources that were unavailable in the highland regions. Cotton grown in the coastal lands became a crucial component of the imperial tribute system, as this fiber was essential for producing the textiles that serve as both trade goods and diplomatic gifts. The region's cacao production supplied the beans that were used as currency throughout Mesoamerica, while exotic bird feathers from the tropical forests adorned the ceremonial costumes of nobles and priests in Tenochtitlan. The establishment of imperial administration in the Asta required the creation of new governmental institutions adapted to the unique characteristics of the region. Rather than attempting to impose highland political structures on coastal communities, Mexico administrators developed hybrid systems that incorporated local traditions while ensuring imperial control. Native rulers who submitted to Mexico authority were allowed to retain their positions as tributary lords, responsible for collecting tribute and maintaining order within their territories. The tribute obligations imposed on Haste communities reflected both imperial needs and local capabilities. Agricultural regions were required to deliver specified quantities of cotton maize and other foodstuffs, while communities with access to specialized resources such as amber, tropical hardwoods, or medicinal plants were obligated to provide these materials for imperial use. The tribute assessments were carefully calculated to extract maximum value without destroying local economies or provoking rebellions that would require costly military interventions. The success of the Aztec campaigns established a template for imperial expansion that would be employed throughout Moctum, Fern's reign. The combination of a diplomatic preparation, tactical adaptation, and administrative flexibility proved effective in regions with diverse environmental and cultural characteristics. The wealth extracted from conquered territories funded further military expeditions, while the administrative experience gained in governing distant provinces enhanced the empire's capacity for continued expansion. Following the consolidation of Mexico control over the Azteca, Moctezuma I turned his attention to the southern regions of the empire, targeting the Mixtec and Zapotec peoples of Oaxaca. This mountainous region presented different challenges from the coastal lowlands, as the terrain was characterized by deep valleys separated by rugged highlands that made military movement difficult and communication between scattered settlements problematic. The political organization of Oaxaca differed significantly from both the city-state systems of central Mexico and the village-based societies of the Azteca. The mixed peoples had developed complex kingdoms centered around fortified hilltop cities that controlled surrounding agricultural valleys. These kingdoms were ruled by hereditary nobles who claimed divine ancestry and maintained elaborate court systems that rivaled those of the major powers in central Mexico. The Zapotec civilization, centered around the ancient city of Monte Alban, possessed even more sophisticated political institutions and had maintained its independence for centuries through a combination of military prowess and diplomatic skill. The conquest of Oaxaca required a different approach from the rapid campaigns that had proven successful in other regions. The mountainous terrain favored defensive warfare, allowing relatively small forces to hold strategic passes against much larger armies. The scattered nature of population centers meant that conquering individual communities did not necessarily provide control over surrounding territories, as other settlements could continue resistance from their own fortified positions. Moctezuma's strategy for conquering Oaxaca emphasized the systematic reduction of enemy strongholds through prolonged siege warfare. Mexico engineers developed new techniques for conducting operations in mountainous terrain, including portable siege equipment that could be disassembled for transport through narrow mountain passes and reassembled at target locations. They also perfected methods for cutting off water supplies to hilltop fortresses, forcing defenders to surrender when their systems were exhausted. The campaigns in Oaxaca extended over nearly a decade as Mexico forces methodically conquered one valley after another while establishing permanent garrisons to prevent reconquest by enemy forces. The process required enormous investments of manpower and resources as supply lines, stretching hundreds of kilometers across difficult terrain, were vulnerable to attack by hostile forces familiar with local conditions. The wealth extracted from Oaxacan territories more than compensated for the costs of conquest. The region was renowned throughout Mesoamerica for its skilled craftsmen who produced luxury goods including gold jewelry, carved jade ornaments, and elaborately decorated textiles. The tribute obligations imposed on conquered Oaxacan communities reflected these specialized capabilities with requirements for delivery of precious metals, gemstones, and finished craft products that enhanced the prestige of the imperial court in Tenochtitlan. The death of Moctezuma I in 1469 brought to power his son Oaxaca, a young ruler whose reign would be marked by both spectacular military successes and costly failures that demonstrated the limits of Mexico military power. Oaxaca was approximately 20 years old at his accession, having spent his adolescence training as a warrior in the elite schools that prepared noble youth for leadership roles in Mexico society. Unlike his father, who'd inherited a relatively stable empire and gradually expanded its boundaries through carefully planned campaigns, Axayacatl faced immediate challenges that required rapid military responses. The most pressing of these challenges involved the growing independence of Tlatelolco, the sister city that had been founded by Mexico's settlers on an island adjacent to Tenochtitlan. Over the decades since its establishment, Tlatelolco had developed into a major commercial center whose merchants, the Paca, maintained trade relationships throughout Mesoamerica. The wealth generated by this commerce had enabled Tlatelolco's rulers to maintain their own military forces and conduct independent diplomatic relations with other city-states. Activities that increasingly conflicted with Tenochtitlan's claims to supremacy within the Mexican domain. The conflict between Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco reflected deeper tensions within Mexico society about the proper relationship between commercial and military activities. Tlatelolco's merchants had accumulated vast wealth through their trading expeditions, but they lacked the military achievements that traditionally conferred high status in Mexico society. Conversely, Tenochtitlan's warrior nobility possessed the martial credentials that legitimized political authority, but they depended on commercial revenues to fund their military expeditions and maintain their luxurious lifestyles. The immediate cause of the war between the two cities involved a succession dispute in Tlatelolco that provided Axayacatl with a pretext for military intervention. When Makihai, the ruler of Tlata, died without a clear heir, competing factions within the city sought support from external allies. Axayacatl backed one claimant while other powers in the valley supported alternative candidates, creating a complex web of alliances that threatened to destabilize the entire region. The Siege of Tlatelolco in 1473 demonstrated the military innovations that had been developed during the previous decades of imperial expansion. Mexico engineers constructed elaborate siege works that isolated the city from external support while protecting their own forces from counterattacks. The use of coordinated infantry assaults, supported by projectile weapons, proved effective against Tlatelolco's defenses, which had been designed primarily to repel raids rather than sustain siege warfare. The fall of Tlatelolco marked the end of independent Mexico city-states and the consolidation of imperial authority under Tenochtitlan's direct control. The conquered cities' commercial networks were incorporated into the imperial administration, providing the central government with unprecedented control over long-distance trade throughout Mesoamerica. The wealth of Tlatelolco's merchants was redistributed to reward loyal supporters of the imperial regime, while the city's military forces were integrated into the imperial army as auxiliary units. Axayacatl's attention then turned westward to the Aztec Empire, a powerful confederation centered in the region now known as Mesoamerica. The Tarascans had developed a sophisticated military organization based on bronze weapons and disciplined infantry formations that had proven effective against traditional Mesoamerican armies, equipped with obsidian weapons and relying on individual combat prowess. Their capital at Zintzinen controlled extensive territories rich in copper, silver, and other metals that were essential for producing the bronze tools and weapons that gave Tarascan forces their technological advantage. The Aztec Empire presented the most formidable military challenge that Mexico forces had yet encountered. Unlike the city-states of central Mexico or the village-based societies of peripheral regions, the Tarascans had developed centralized military institutions capable of fielding large, well-equipped armies under unified command. Their bronze weapons were superior to obsidian implements in both durability and effectiveness, while their disciplined formations proved more effective than the individualistic combat styles favored by Mexico warriors. The campaign against the Tarascans began in 1478 with a series of probing attacks designed to test enemy capabilities and identify potential weaknesses in their defensive systems. These initial encounters revealed the extent of Tarascan military superiority as Mexico forces suffered heavy casualties while achieving minimal tactical gains. The bronze-armed Tarascan infantry proved capable of maintaining formation discipline under pressure, while their archers demonstrated superior range and accuracy compared to Mexico projectile weapons. The decisive battle of the campaign occurred at a location whose exact identity remains disputed among historians, but which contemporary sources describe as a broad plain suitable for large-scale infantry combat. Axayacatl had assembled the largest army in Mexico history, drawing warriors from throughout the empire and including substantial contingents from allied city-states. The Tarascan force was smaller but better equipped and more cohesively organized, with bronze weapons gleaming in the morning sun as disciplined formations advanced across the battlefield. The battle began with exchanges of projectile fire, as both armies sought to disrupt enemy formations before the main infantry engagement. Tarascan archers, protected by large shields and supported by slingers, maintained steady volleys that caused significant casualties among the advancing Mexico warriors. The obsidian-tipped arrows and darts employed by Mexico forces proved less effective against Tarascan bronze armor and shields, creating an immediate disadvantage that would persist throughout the engagement. When the infantry lines finally met the superior metallurgy of Tarascan weapons became decisive. Bronze swords and spear points cut through cotton armor and wooden shields that had provided adequate protection against obsidian weapons. The disciplined formations maintained by Tarascan units allowed them to concentrate their attacks against specific points in the Mexico line, creating gaps that could be exploited by follow-up assaults. The defeat at the hands of the Tarascans represented the first major military setback in Mexican imperial expansion and demonstrated the limitations of traditional Mesoamerican military technology when confronted by more advanced metallurgical techniques. The casualties suffered by Mexico forces were substantial, including many experienced warriors whose loss significantly reduced the empire's military capabilities. More importantly, the defeat damaged the prestige of Mexico arms and encouraged resistance movements in recently conquered territories. The social fabric of the Aztec Empire rested upon a complex hierarchy that determined every aspect of an individual's existence, from the clothes they wore to the foods they consumed and the gods they could approach in prayer. At the apex of this stratified society stood the Pipilin, the hereditary nobility whose bloodlines traced back to the legendary rulers of Tolan and the divine mandate of Quetzalcoatl. These nobles occupied palatial compounds within the ceremonial centers of major cities. Their homes, constructed from carefully cut stone blocks and adorned with intricate murals depicting their ancestors' heroic deeds and divine connections. The Pipilton controlled vast estates worked by tenant farmers and maintained private armies of professional warriors who served as both military forces and symbols of aristocratic power. Noble families owned elaborate featherwork workshops where skilled artisans created the magnificent headdresses and ceremonial garments that distinguished the elite from commoners. Their children received education in the Calmac, exclusive schools attached to major temples where they learned the complex writing system, astronomical calculations, and ritual procedures necessary for governing the empire's diverse populations. Within the noble class itself, careful distinctions separated various ranks and privileges. The Tudi held the highest positions, serving as provincial governors, supreme court judges, and military commanders who led major campaigns. These individuals possessed hereditary titles to specific territories and received tribute directly from subordinate communities. Below them ranked the Pili, younger sons of noble families and distinguished warriors who had earned elevation through exceptional battlefield achievements. The Pili served as administrators, priests, and military officers, forming the backbone of the imperial bureaucracy. The Mkwelyn comprised the vast majority of the empire's population, including farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and laborers whose daily efforts sustained the complex urban centers and agricultural systems that supported imperial expansion. Unlike the hereditary nobility, commoners possessed no automatic claim to political office or religious authority. Yet their social position was far from static. Exceptional warriors could earn noble status through capturing enemy soldiers in battle, while successful merchants accumulated wealth that rivaled that of hereditary aristocrats. Commoner families lived in modest adobe houses clustered around neighborhood temples dedicated to their Calpules patron deities. These residential compounds typically included small courtyards where women ground maize on stone metates and men crafted tools from obsidian, wood and bone. The walls were decorated with simple geometric patterns painted in earth-tone tones, while the floors consisted of packed clay covered with woven mats that served as sleeping surfaces and dining areas. The economic activities of the Makahultin varied considerably depending on their location within the empire and the natural resources available in their regions. In the Valley of Mexico, many commoners worked the extensive Chinamper systems that surrounded Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco, cultivating maize, beans, squash, tomatoes, and chili peppers in the artificial islands that floated on the lake surface. These farmers possessed detailed knowledge of water management techniques, crop rotation cycles, and soil preparation methods that maximized agricultural productivity in the challenging lacustrine environment. Craftsmen formed specialized guilds that controlled the production and distribution of essential goods throughout the empire. Stone workers quarried volcanic rock from the mountains surrounding the valley and shaped it into grinding stones, building blocks and sculptural elements for temples and palaces. Obsidian knappers created the razor-sharp blades that armed warriors and provided cutting tools for daily use. Their workshops filled with the musical tinkling of stone flakes falling to the ground as skilled artisan shaped volcanic glass into deadly implements. Textile production occupied thousands of women throughout the empire, from noble ladies who supervised elaborate workshops to commoner wives who spun cotton and maguey fibers into thread during evening hours after completing their household duties. The complexity of textile designs indicated the wearer's social status, with geometric patterns in natural colors marking commoner garments, while elaborate pictorial designs in brilliant dyes distinguished noble attire. The most prestigious textiles incorporated exotic materials such as rabbit fur, tropical bird feathers, and threads spun from precious metals. The pucker occupied a unique position within Aztec society, serving as longue distance merchants whose trading expeditions extended the empire's economic influence far beyond its military frontiers. These professional traders organized themselves into hereditary guilds that maintained their own temples, schools, and judicial systems separate from those of other social groups. Pochteca expeditions resembled military campaigns in their organization and scale, with armed guards protecting valuable cargoes as merchant caravans traveled hundreds of kilometers through hostile territories to reach distant markets. The wealth accumulated by successful pockets enabled them to live in luxury that rivaled that of the nobility. Yet their commercial origins prevented them from holding high political office or participating in the most exclusive religious ceremonies. This tension between economic power and social status created complex dynamics within Aztec society as established nobles sought to control merchant activities, while successful traders attempted to convert their wealth into political influence through strategic marriages and religious patronage. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were Tacitan, individuals who had lost their freedom through warfare, debt, or criminal conviction. Aztec slavery differed fundamentally from the plantation systems that would later develop in other parts of the Americas, as slaves retained certain legal rights and could own property, marry freely, and potentially earn or purchase their freedom. Many Tacatan worked as domestic servants in noble households where they performed specialized tasks such as food preparation, textile production, and childcare that required skill and trust. The educational systems that transmitted Aztec culture across generations reflected and reinforced the empire's social stratification while providing mechanisms for limited social mobility. The Karmak served the children of nobles and successful merchants, offering rigorous training in writing, mathematics, astronomy, history, and religious ritual. Students in these elite schools learn to read and interpret the complex pictographic codices that recorded imperial laws, tribute obligations, and historical events. They studied the intricate calendar systems that governed religious observances and agricultural activities, mastering calculations that predicted eclipses, determined auspicious dates for military campaigns, and coordinated festivals across the empire's vast territories. The curriculum of the Karmic emphasized moral discipline and intellectual rigor, with students subjected to harsh punishments for academic failures or behavioral infractions. Young nobles learned to pierce their tongues, ears, and genitals with obsidian blades and mui thorns as acts of religious devotion, while memorizing the complex poetry and songs that preserved historical traditions and mythological narratives. The schools maintained extensive libraries of codices painted on bark paper and deerskin, containing knowledge accumulated over centuries of Mesoamerican civilization. The Telpot Cali provided education for commoner children, focusing on practical skills and military training rather than the esoteric knowledge reserved for the elite. These neighborhood schools taught boys to use weapons effectively, perform basic religious ceremonies, and understand their obligations as tribute-paying subjects of the empire. Girls received instruction in textile production, food preparation, and household management from experienced women who passed down traditional techniques through hands-on demonstration and practice. Military training in the Telpakali began with wooden weapons and progressed to obsidian armed implements as students demonstrated competence and maturity. Young warriors learned to fight in formation, coordinate attacks with other units, and capture enemies alive for sacrificial purposes. The schools also provided instruction in the construction and maintenance of military equipment, including the cotton armor that protected warriors in battle and the elaborate shields decorated with feathers and precious stones that indicated their owners' achievements and social status. Daily life in Tenochtitlan revolved around the complex rhythms of the ritual calendar and the practical demands of urban existence in a city that housed between 150,000 and 300,000 inhabitants. The urban landscape consisted of interconnected islands linked by causeways and canals that served as transportation arteries for the constant flow of people and goods. Residential areas were organized according to Kalpuri affiliations, with each neighborhood maintaining its own temple, school, and market area where local products were exchanged for goods from other parts of the city and empire. Housing styles varied dramatically according to social status and economic resources. Noble residences occupied extensive compounds that included multiple buildings arranged around courtyards planted with flowers and shade trees. The main structures featured stone foundations, adobe brick walls, and flat roofs that serve as additional living and working spaces. Interior rooms were decorated with elaborate murals depicting mythological scenes, historical events, and genealogical information that established the occupants' noble credentials. Common houses were smaller and simpler, typically consisting of 1 or 2 rooms with thatched roofs and walls made from adobe bricks or lee and door construction. These modest dwellings nonetheless provided adequate shelter and included features such as built-in storage areas, raised sleeping platforms, and small shrines dedicated to household deities. Many houses included workshops where family members practice specialized crafts with pottery kilns, weaving looms, and tool-making areas integrated into the domestic architecture. The clothing worn by Tenochtitlan's inhabitants served as immediate indicators of social status, occupation, and regional origin. Nobles dressed in elaborately decorated garments made from cotton textiles dyed in brilliant colors and adorned with geometric patterns, featherwork, and precious stone ornaments. Men wore loincloths, cloaks, and sandals, while women donned skirts and blouses that covered their bodies modestly while displaying their family's wealth and status through the quality of materials and decoration. Commoners were legally restricted to wearing simple garments made from mui fiber, dyed in muted earth tones, and decorated with basic geometric patterns. Men typically wore loincloths and cloaks that reached their knees, while women donned plain skirts and blouses that prioritized functionality over ornamentation. The Sumpta laws that governed clothing choices were strictly enforced with severe punishments for individuals who attempted to dress above their social station. The food consumed by different social groups reflected both economic resources and cultural preferences that had developed over centuries of Mesoamerican civilization. Nobles enjoyed elaborate meals featuring exotic ingredients imported from distant regions of the empire, including tropical fruits, marine fish, and game birds that were unavailable to commoners. Their kitchens employed specialized cooks who prepared complex dishes seasoned with rare spices and served on decorated pottery vessels that demonstrated their owners' sophisticated tastes. Maize formed the foundation of all Aztec diets consumed in various forms, including tortillas, tamales, porridge, and fermented beverages that provided essential calories and nutrients. Commoner families supplemented their maize-based meals with beans, squash, chili peppers, and whatever protein sources they could afford, including small game, fish from the lake system, and domesticated dogs and turkeys raised in their household compounds. The market system centered at Platalo represented one of the most sophisticated commercial institutions in the pre-Columbian Americas, attracting merchants and customers from throughout Mesoamerica to exchange goods in a carefully regulated environment. The main market occupied a vast plaza that could accommodate over 60,000 people on major trading days, with specialized sections devoted to different categories of merchandise. Vendors arranged their goods on woven mats spread across the ground, creating colorful displays that showcase the empire's economic diversity and productive capacity. Food vendors offered prepared meals, fresh produce, and specialty items such as chocolate drinks flavored with honey and spices that provided refreshment for shoppers and workers. Craft specialists sold pottery, textiles, tools, and ornamental objects that demonstrated the high level of artistic achievement attained by Aztec artisans. Merchants from distant regions displayed exotic goods, including jade ornaments from Guatemala, amber from Chiapas, and tropical bird feathers for the coastal lands that added luxury and prestige to noble households. The market operated according to strict regulations enforced by appointed officials who monitored weights and measures, resolved disputes between buyers and sellers, and maintained order among the crowds of shoppers. Prices were established through negotiation between buyers and sellers, with cacao beans serving as a standard medium of exchange for small transactions, while cotton textiles and quills filled with gold dust facilitated larger purchases. Aztec artistic achievements encompassed a wide range of media and techniques that reflected both religious devotion and aesthetic sophistication. Sculptors carved massive stone monuments that adorned temple complexes and public spaces, creating powerful images of deities, rulers, and mythological scenes that communicated imperial ideology to diverse populations. The famous calendar stone discovered in the main plaza of Tenochtitlan exemplified the integration of artistic excellence with astronomical knowledge. Its intricate carvings depicting the cyclical nature of time and the cosmic forces that govern human destiny. Featherwork represented perhaps the most distinctive Aztec artistic traditions, with skilled craftsmen creating elaborate compositions using tropical bird plumage arranged in complex patterns and designs. These magnificent works adorn the costumes of nobles and priests during important ceremonies, their brilliant colors and intricate detail serving as symbols of divine favor and a social distinction. The techniques required to create featherwork masterpieces were closely guarded secrets passed down through hereditary guilds that maintained exclusive control over this prestigious art form. The production of codices represented the pinnacle of Aztec intellectual achievement, combining artistic skill with scholarly knowledge to create documents that preserved historical records, religious teachings, and administrative information. Scribes trained in the Karmak schools painted pictographic symbols on bark paper and deer skin using brushes made from animal hair and pigments derived from minerals, plants, and insects. The resulting manuscripts served as libraries, legal documents, and instructional materials that transmitted knowledge across generations and throughout the empire's territories. The Aztec calendar system demonstrated the sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries of Mesoamerican observation and calculation. The basic structure combined a 260-day ritual calendar with a 3,605-day solar calendar, creating a complex cycle that required 52 years to complete. This system enabled Aztec astronomers to predict eclipses, track the movements of planets, and coordinate religious festivals with agricultural activities across the empire's diverse climatic zones. The religious worldview that governed Aztec society rested upon a complex understanding of cosmic forces locked in perpetual struggle with the survival of humanity, depended upon maintaining delicate balances through ritual action and divine appeasement. At the center of this intricate theological system stood Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of war and the sun, whose daily journey across the sky represented the eternal battle between light and darkness, order and chaos, life and death. The Mexica understood their patron deity as a young warrior born fully armed from his mother Cuauhtémoc's womb, destined to defend the world against the forces of destruction that threatened to plunge creation back into primordial darkness. Huitzilopochtli's mythological biography established the theological foundation for Aztec imperial expansion and military culture. According to the sacred narratives preserved in temple schools and recited during religious ceremonies, the god had been conceived when his mother, the earth goddess Quetzalcoatl, was impregnated by a ball of hummingbird feathers that fell from the sky while she was sweeping the temple at Coatepec. His jealous siblings, led by his sister Coyutzaki, the moon goddess, conspired to kill their mother before the miraculous birth could occur, viewing the pregnancy as a source of shame and dishonor to their family. The moment of Huitzilopochtli's birth marked the beginning of the cosmic war that would define Aztec religious consciousness. Emerging from his mother's womb as a fully grown warrior armed with a fire serpent and a shield decorated with eagle feathers, the newborn god immediately attacked his siblings who had threatened his mother. In the ensuing battle, Pochtli dismembered Coyutzaki and hurled her head into the sky, where it became the moon, while scattering his other siblings across the heavens as stars. This primordial conflict established the pattern of cosmic struggle that required constant renewal through human action and divine intervention. The daily solar cycle was understood as a reenactment of Pochtli's eternal battle against the forces of darkness. Each dawn represented the young god's victory over his siblings, while each sunset marked the beginning of his nightly journey through the underworld, where he fought against the lords of death and darkness to ensure that the sun would rise again. This cosmic drama required human participation through ritual activities that provided the god with the strength necessary to continue his struggle. The most important of these rituals involved the offering of human blood and hearts, substances that contain the vital essence needed to nourish the solar deity and maintain the world's existence. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity, represented a contrasting but complementary aspect of Aztec religious thought. Unlike Huitzilopochtli's association with warfare and sacrifice, Quetzalcoatl embodied wisdom, creativity, and the civilizing arts that distinguish humans from animals. The god was credited with creating humanity in the current cosmic age by mixing his own blood with bones stolen from the underworld, a heroic act that established the fundamental debt that humans owed to the divine realm. Quetzalcoatl had also given humans the gift of maize, the sacred grain that formed the foundation of Mesoamerican civilization by transforming himself into an ant and carrying the precious seeds from their hiding place within a mountain. The dual nature of Quetzal's symbolism reflected the Aztec understanding of the fundamental tensions that characterized existence. As a feathered serpent, the deity combined the earthbound nature of reptiles with the celestial freedom of birds, representing the unity of opposites that governed cosmic processes. The god's association with wind linked him to the invisible forces that brought rain clouds from the ocean and carried the seeds of plants across vast distances, making him essential to agricultural fertility and seasonal renewal. Quetzalcoatl's role as the patron of learning and the priesthood made him particularly important to the educated elite who governed Aztec society. The god was believed to have invented the calendar systems that regulated religious observances and agricultural activities, while also creating the writing systems that preserved historical knowledge and religious teachings. Priests who served in his temples underwent rigorous training in astronomy, mathematics, and ritual procedures, becoming the intellectual leaders who maintained the complex ceremonial cycles that sustained cosmic order. Tenochtitlan, whose name meant smoking mirror, embodied the darker aspects of divine power that the Aztecs recognized as essential components of cosmic balance. This deity was associated with night, jaguars, sorcery, and the unpredictable forces that could bring either great fortune or devastating destruction to human communities. Tezcatlipoca was often depicted as a young man missing one foot, which had been bitten off by the earth monster during the creation of the world, a sacrifice that enabled the formation of the solid ground upon which humans could build their civilizations. The relationship between Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl formed one of the central themes of Aztec mythology, with the two deities locked in eternal rivalry that drove the cycles of creation and destruction that shaped cosmic history. According to the sacred narratives, these divine conflicts had resulted in the destruction and recreation of the world multiple times, with each cosmic age ending when one deity gained temporary supremacy over the other. The current world age, known as the Fifth Sun, had been created through the cooperation of all the gods. But it too was destined to end in catastrophic destruction unless humans maintained the proper ritual relationships with the divine realm. Tlaloc, the rain god, controlled the life-giving waters that made agriculture possible in the semi-arid environment of central Mexico. This ancient deity, whose worship predated the arrival of the Mexica by many centuries, was depicted as a figure with gobble-like eyes and prominent fangs, often surrounded by symbols representing clouds, lightning, and falling rain. Calix mountaintop shrines dotted the landscape around the Valley of Mexico, marking the sacred peaks where rain clouds gathered and from which life-sustaining moisture descended to nourish the crops that fed the empire's growing population. The worship of Tlaloc involved elaborate ceremonies that acknowledged the god's control over the agricultural cycles that governed human survival. During the dry season, priests conducted rituals designed to attract the rain clouds that would bring the moisture necessary for planting and crop growth. These ceremonies often involved the sacrifice of children, whose tears were believed to be particularly pleasing to the rain god, and whose innocent suffering could move him to compassion for human needs. The child victims were often purchased from poor families or captured in warfare, then elaborately dressed and honored before being offered to the deity at mountaintop shrines or thrown into sacred cenotes. The Aztec understanding of cosmic time was structured around the concept of the five suns, successive world ages that have been created and destroyed through the actions of competing deities. Each cosmic age had been dominated by a different god and had ended through a specific form of catastrophe that reflected the ruling deity's particular characteristics and powers. The first sun had been ruled by Tezcatlipoca and had ended when Quetzalcoatl knocked his rival from the sky, causing him to transform into a jaguar that devoured all the giants who had inhabited the world. The second sun had been governed by Quetzalcoatl and had ended when Tezcatlipoca's revenge transformed humans into monkeys and destroyed their civilization with hurricanes. The third sun had been ruled by Tlaloc, and had ended in a rain of fire that consumed the world and transformed its human inhabitants into birds. The fourth sun had been governed by Tlaloc's consort, the goddess of rivers and lakes, and had ended in a great flood that turned humans into fish and destroyed all the works of civilization. The current fifth sun, known as Nahue, Olin, or for movement, had been created through the self-sacrifice of the gods who threw themselves into a cosmic fire to provide the energy necessary for the sun and moon to move across the sky. The creation of the fifth sun established the theological framework that justified human sacrifice as a cosmic necessity rather than merely a religious preference. According to the sacred narratives, the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the current world age, establishing a precedent that required humans to reciprocate through their own offerings of blood and life. The god Nanahuatzin, a humble and diseased deity, had volunteered to throw himself into the cosmic fire to become the sun, while the proud god Tuzist-Catl had hesitated before following his example to become the moon. This mythological event demonstrated that divine sacrifice was necessary to maintain cosmic order, and that humans owed their existence to the gods' willingness to give their lives for the continuation of the world. The ritual calendar that governed Aztec religious life was based on the complex interaction of the 260-day Tonalpoi and the 360 days UPI, creating cycles of sacred time that regulated both individual destiny and community obligations. The Tonopah-Hualli combined 20-day signs with 13 numbers, creating a sacred calendar that was used for divination, naming children, and determining propitious dates for important activities. Each day in this calendar was ruled by specific deities and possessed particular characteristics that influenced the fate of individuals born on that date and the success of activities undertaken during that period. The Shupahali consisted of 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 additional days that were considered unlucky and dangerous. Each month was dedicated to particular deities and involved specific ceremonies that maintained the proper relationships between humans and gods throughout the annual cycle. The festivals associated with each month required elaborate preparations involving the entire community, from the gathering of ritual materials to the construction of temporary temples and the training of ceremonial participants. The new fire ceremony, conducted every 52 years when the 2 calendar cycles returned to their starting position, simultaneously represented the most important ritual in the Aztec religious system. This elaborate ceremony, known as Shu Pilai, or binding of the years, involved the extinguishing of all fires throughout the empire and the ritual destruction of household goods, pottery, and clothing. The population would fast and remain awake throughout the night, anxiously awaiting the successful completion of the ceremony that would ensure the continuation of the current world age. The ceremony itself took place on a sacred mountain outside Tenochtitlan, where priests would carefully observe the movement of the Pleiades constellation to determine the exact moment when the new cycle should begin. At the critical moment, a fire priest would use a wooden fire drill to kindle a new flame on the chest of a sacrificial victim whose heart had been removed to provide a sacred space for the cosmic renewal. If the fire ignited successfully, it confirmed that the gods had agreed to allow the world to continue for another 52-year cycle. The new fire would then be carried to temples throughout the empire, where it would be used to relight the sacred flames that burned continuously in honor of various deities. The seasonal festivals that marked the agricultural cycle provided regular opportunities for communities throughout the empire to participate in the ritual activities that maintained cosmic balance. The festival of Atlawalo, celebrated during the first month of the year, honored the mountain spirits who controlled rainfall through ceremonies that included the sacrifice of children at mountaintop shrines. The festival of Tosani, held during the second month, involved the blessing of seed corn and the performance of rituals designed to ensure successful planting and crop growth. The festival of Hur Talsi, celebrated during the third month marked the beginning of the planting season with elaborate ceremonies that honored the earth goddess Quadi, Q, and her various manifestations. The festival of Tox cattle held during the fourth month involved the selection and sacrifice of a young man who had been chosen to represent the god Tezcatlipoca for an entire year. This individual, known as the Exipla, or God's image, lived in luxury and was treated as a living deity before being sacrificed at the festival's climax, ensuring the god's continued presence among his people. The practice of human sacrifice permeated Aztec religious life at every level, from the grand ceremonies that marked major festivals to the daily offerings that maintained the sacred fires in neighborhood temples. The Aztecs recognized multiple forms of sacrificial death, each appropriate to different deities and ceremonial contexts. The most common method involved the removal of the victim's heart while they were still alive, a procedure that required considerable skill and was performed by specially trained priests using obsidian knives with razor-sharp edges. Heart sacrifice typically took place on the steps of temple pyramids, with the victims stretched backward over a curved stone that thrust their chest upward and made the priest's task easier. For assistants would hold the victim's limbs while the priest made a swift incision below the rib cage, reached into the chest cavity, and extracted the still beating heart. The organ would then be offered to the deity by being placed in a special receptacle or held up toward the sun, while the victim's body would be rolled down the temple steps to waiting attendants who would dispose of it according to ritual requirements. Drowning was the preferred method of sacrifice for victims offered to Tlaloc and other water deities, with ceremonies often taking place at sacred springs, lakes, or specially constructed pools within temple complexes. The victims, frequently children whose tears were believed to be particularly pleasing to the rain god, would be dressed in elaborate costumes and jewelry before being thrown into the water or held beneath the surface until they drowned. These sacrifices were often conducted during times of drought when the community desperately needed divine intervention to bring life-saving rainfall. Flaying was employed in ceremonies honoring Ziptoik, the god of spring and agricultural renewal, whose name meant our Lord, the Flayed One. Victims sacrificed to this deity would first have their hearts removed in the conventional manner, after which their skin would be carefully peeled away in a single piece. Priests would then wear these human skins during subsequent ritual activities, symbolically representing the renewal of life that occurred each spring when plants shed their old growth and produced fresh shoots and leaves. Burning alive was reserved for victims of susted purification and cosmic renewal. These sacrifices typically involved throwing victims into large fires or binding them to poles and slowly roasting them over flames, with the extended suffering believed to be particularly pleasing to the deity. The fire god's festivals often coincided with the completion of major construction projects or the dedication of new temples, events that required powerful ritual acts to ensure divine approval and protection. The social and political functions of human sacrifice extended far beyond its religious significance, serving as a mechanism for social control, political integration, and imperial legitimacy. The spectacular nature of major sacrificial ceremonies demonstrated the power of the state and the gods it served, creating awe and fear among both subjects and potential enemies. Foreign dignitaries invited to witness these events would return to their home territories with vivid accounts of Aztec power and divine favor, often encouraging submission rather than resistance to imperial expansion. The capture of enemies for sacrificial purposes provided a crucial motivation for Aztec warfare, transforming military campaigns from simple conquest expeditions into sacred quests that served both political and religious objectives. Warriors competed for the honor of capturing prestigious victims, with successful captives receiving social advancement and material rewards that encouraged continued military service. The most skilled warriors could achieve noble status through their battlefield achievements, creating a meritocratic element within the otherwise hereditary social hierarchy. The ritual consumption of sacrificial victims' flesh provided a form of communion between the human and divine realms, while also serving practical nutritional functions in a society that lacked large domesticated animals. The bodies of sacrificed warriors were typically distributed among the captor's family and neighbors, who would prepare the flesh in elaborate stews seasoned with chili peppers and other spices. This ritual cannibalism was understood as a way of absorbing the spiritual power of brave enemies, while honoring their courage through ceremonial consumption. The training of priests who conducted these complex sacrificial rituals required years of intensive education in specialized temple schools that preserved the detailed knowledge necessary for proper ceremonial performance. Young men selected for the priesthood underwent rigorous physical and mental conditioning that included prolonged fasting, sleep deprivation, and painful bloodletting rituals that demonstrated their dedication to divine service. They learned to read the pictographic codices that contained ritual instructions, memorize the elaborate songs and prayers that accompanied ceremonies, and mastered the precise techniques required for different forms of sacrifice. The priesthood maintained strict hierarchies that reflected both spiritual authority and administrative responsibility within the complex religious institutions that governed Aztec society. The highest-ranking priests, known as Tlanak, or those who give something, supervised the major temple complexes and conducted the most important ceremonies that maintained cosmic order. These individuals possessed encyclopedic knowledge of ritual procedures, astronomical calculations, and mythological traditions that enabled them to serve as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. The ascension of Moctezuma to the throne of Tenochtitlan in 1502 marked the beginning of the most magnificent and ultimately tragic period in Aztec history. At approximately 35 years of age, Moctezuma II inherited an empire that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing diverse peoples, climates, and resources that generated unprecedented wealth for the Triple Alliance. Unlike his predecessors who had built their reputation through military conquest and territorial expansion, Moctezuma II would focus his reign on consolidating imperial power through administrative sophistication, architectural grandeur, and the systematic extraction of tribute from subject peoples across Mesoamerica. The new Huey Tlatoani possessed impeccable credentials for his elevated position, having served as a high priest of Hutzila before his election by the Council of Nobles. His religious training had provided him with comprehensive knowledge of the ritual calendar, astronomical calculations, and theological principles that governed Aztec society, while his noble birth connected him directly to the royal lineage that traced its origins to the legendary rulers of ancient Tolan. Moctezuma II's education in the Karmak had emphasized the intellectual and ceremonial aspects of leadership rather than the purely military focus that had characterized earlier rulers, reflecting the empire's evolution from a confederation of warrior city-states into a sophisticated administrative state. The administrative reforms implemented during Moctezuma II's reign transformed the imperial government from a relatively loose collection of tributary relationships into a centralized bureaucracy capable of managing the complex logistics of governing millions of subjects across thousands of square kilometers. The emperor established new governmental departments responsible for specific aspects of imperial administration, including tribute collection, military organization, judicial proceedings, and religious ceremonies. Each department was staffed by professional administrators drawn from the ranks of the nobility and trained in specialized schools that taught the technical skills required for effective governance. The tribute collection system reached its most sophisticated form under Moctezuma II's direction, with detailed records maintained of every community's obligations and payment schedules. Imperial scribes created elaborate codices that documented the specific goods required from each tributary province, the quantities expected, and the dates when deliveries were due in Tenochtitlan's warehouses. These administrative documents represented masterpieces of pictographic art and practical organization, with colorful illustrations depicting the various products that flowed into the imperial capital from throughout Mesoamerica. The wealth generated by this systematic tribute collection enabled Moctezuma II to maintain a court of unprecedented luxury and complexity. The imperial palace in Tenochtitlan expanded to encompass multiple buildings housing thousands of servants, administrators, craftsmen, and guards who supported the emperor's daily activities. The palace complex included private apartments for the royal family, audience halls where foreign dignitaries presented tribute and petitions, workshops where skilled artisans created luxury goods for imperial use, and gardens where exotic plants and animals from throughout the empire were displayed as symbols of Moctezuma's dominion over diverse environments. The emperor's daily routine reflected the ceremonial nature of Aztec kingship and the religious obligations that accompanied supreme political authority. Moctezuma II began each day with elaborate purification rituals that included bathing in sacred spring water, burning copal incense, and offering his own blood to the gods through tongue and ear, piercing with obsidian blades and maguey thorns. These private ceremonies were followed by public appearances in which the emperor received reports from provincial governors, heard legal cases that required his personal judgment, and conducted the religious observances that maintained cosmic order throughout his domains. The emperor's meals exemplified the abundance and diversity of resources available to the imperial court. Palace kitchens prepared hundreds of different dishes daily, utilizing ingredients imported from every corner of the empire and prepared by specialized cooks who had mastered the culinary traditions of various regions. Fresh fish arrived daily from both the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean, transported by relay runners who covered the hundreds of kilometers between the coasts and the highland capital in less than 2 days. Tropical fruits from the land regions were preserved in honey or dried for year-round consumption, while game birds from the mountain forests were kept alive in palace aviaries until needed for imperial banquets. The tribute system that supported this imperial luxury operated through a complex network of provincial administrators, local rulers, and specialized merchants who coordinated the collection and transportation of goods from throughout Mesoamerica. Each tributo province was assessed according to its population, agricultural productivity, and access to valuable resources, with obligations carefully calculated to extract maximum value without destroying local economies or provoking rebellions that would require costly military interventions. The provinces of the Gulf Coast contributed vast quantities of cotton textiles, cacao beans, tropical bird feathers, and precious stones that were essential for maintaining the imperial court's magnificent appearance. Cotton grown in the humid lands was woven into fine textiles that served as both trade goods and diplomatic gifts, while cacao beans functioned as currency throughout the empire and provided the raw material for the chocolate drinks that were consumed exclusively by the nobility. The brilliant feathers of quetzals, parrots, and other tropical birds were crafted into elaborate headdresses and ceremonial garments that distinguished imperial officials from lesser nobles, while jade, amber, and other precious stones were carved into ornaments that adorned the emperor and his closest associates. The highland provinces contributed different categories of tribute that reflected their particular environmental characteristics and economic specializations. The volcanic regions surrounding the Valley of Mexico provided obsidian for weapons and tools, while the mountain forests supplied timber for construction projects and fuel for the countless fires that burned continuously in temples and palaces throughout the capital. Agricultural regions contributed maize, beans, chili peppers, and other foodstuffs that fed the empire's growing urban populations, while communities with access to salt deposits provided this essential commodity that was used for food preservation and religious ceremonies. The western provinces controlled by Tarascan peoples remained largely independent of Aztec tribute obligations, having successfully resisted imperial expansion through their superior metallurgical technology and disciplined military organization. However, the border regions between the two empires generated significant trade relationships that brought copper, silver, and bronze objects into Aztec territories in exchange for tropical products and luxury goods controlled by Tenochtitlan's merchants. These commercial relationships provided both empires with access to resources that were unavailable within their own territories, while maintaining the political independence that prevented costly military conflicts. The northern frontiers of the empire extended into the semi-arid regions, inhabited by Chichima peoples whose nomadic lifestyle and warrior culture resembled those of the Mexica's own ancestors. These communities provided tribute in the form of animal hides, medicinal plants, and precious minerals extracted from mountain deposits, while also serving as buffer zones that protected the empire's settled populations from raids by more distant nomadic groups. The incorporation of Chichime-Meca warriors into imperial armies provided the Aztecs with scouts and light infantry, whose desert survival skills complemented the more conventional military capabilities of highland troops. The construction projects undertaken during Moctezuma II's reign transformed Tenochtitlan into one of the most magnificent cities in the world, with architectural achievements that rivaled those of contemporary European capitals, while incorporating uniquely Mesoamerican design principles and construction techniques. The expansion of the Temple Mayor, the Great Pyramid that dominated the city's ceremonial center, required the labor of thousands of workers and the transportation of massive quantities of stone, timber, and decorative materials from throughout the empire. The completed temple complex rose approximately 60 m above the level of the surrounding plaza. Its twin shrines dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, representing the fundamental duality of Aztec religious thought. The pyramid's exterior was covered with carved stone panels depicting mythological scenes, historical events, and astronomical observations that communicated imperial ideology to the diverse populations who visited the capital for religious festivals and tribute presentations. The summit shrines housed elaborate sculptures of the patron deities crafted from precious materials, including gold, jade, and tropical bird feathers that demonstrated the empire's wealth and artistic sophistication. The ceremonial plaza surrounding the Templora was expanded to accommodate the massive crowds that gathered for major religious festivals, with new buildings constructed to house the priests, administrators, and visiting dignitaries who participated in these elaborate ceremonies. The plaza's stone pavement was laid in geometric patterns that reflected astronomical alignments and cosmological principles, while drainage channels beneath the surface prevented flooding during the rainy season and maintained the sacred space's ritual purity. The palace complex adjacent to the ceremonial center underwent similar expansion during Moctezuma II's reign, with new buildings added to house the growing imperial bureaucracy and the specialized craftsmen who produced luxury goods for court use. The emperor's private residence included multiple courtyards planted with flowers and shade trees, reflecting pools that provided cooling during hot weather, and aviaries where exotic birds from throughout the empire were maintained as symbols of imperial dominion over diverse environments. The palace workshops employed hundreds of skilled artisans who created the magnificent objects that adorned the imperial court and served as diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers. Feather workers crafted elaborate headdresses using tropical bird plumage arranged in complex patterns that required years of training to master, while goldsmiths created jewelry and ornamental objects using techniques that produced delicate filigree work and realistic sculptural forms. Lapidaras carved jade, obsidian, and other precious stones into ornaments and ritual objects whose symbolic meanings were understood by educated members of the nobility, but remained mysterious to common observers. The expansion of Tenochtitlan's urban infrastructure during this period included the construction of new causeways that improved transportation between the island capital and the mainland. Additional aqueducts that supplied fresh water to the growing population and expanded canal systems that facilitated the movement of the goods throughout the city. The engineering challenges involved in these projects required innovative solutions that demonstrated the advanced technical capabilities of Aztec architects and builders. The causeway connecting Tenochtitlan to Tlacopan was rebuilt with wider roadways and more sophisticated bridge systems that could accommodate increased traffic while maintaining the defensive capabilities that were essential for protecting the capital against potential enemies. The new bridges incorporated mechanical systems that allowed sections to be raised or lowered quickly, enabling the passage of large canoes while providing the ability to cut off land access to the city during emergencies. The aqueduct system that supplied Tenochtitlan with fresh water was expanded through the construction of additional channels that tapped springs in the hills surrounding the valley, while sophisticated distribution networks carried water to neighborhoods throughout the city. The engineering of these water systems required precise calculations of elevation, flow rates, and pressure differentials that demonstrated the mathematical capabilities of Aztec architects and the organizational skills of the administrators who coordinated these massive construction projects. The omens and prophecies that began appearing during the later years of Moctezuma reign created an atmosphere of anxiety and supernatural dread that would profoundly influence the empire's response to the arrival of Spanish conquistadors. The first of these portents appeared around 1510, when a comet with a long, brilliant tail became visible in the pre-dawn sky for several months. Aztec astronomers who maintained detailed records of celestial phenomena and their earthly correlations interpreted this apparition as a warning of impending catastrophe that would affect the entire empire. The comet's appearance was followed by a series of additional omens that reinforced fears of approaching disaster. A mysterious fire destroyed the temple of Huitzilopochtli without any apparent cause, burning so intensely that water seemed to feed the flames rather than extinguish them. The temple of Huacuti, the fire god, was struck by lightning during a clear sky, an event that was interpreted as divine displeasure with imperial policies or religious practices. Strange voices were heard crying in the night, warning of the destruction of Tenochtitlan and the end of Aztec dominion over Mesoamerica. The most disturbing of these supernatural manifestations involve the appearance of ghostly figures and monstrous beings that were witnessed by reliable observers throughout the empire. Fishermen reported seeing a woman walking on the surface of Lake Texcoco, weeping and lamenting the fate that awaited her children. Hunters encountered two-headed men in the forest surrounding the capital, while farmers discovered birds and animals with human faces that spoke prophecies of doom before vanishing into thin air. Moctezuma's response to these omens reflected both his deep religious convictions and his understanding of their potential political implications. The emperor consulted with the most learned priests and astronomers in his realm, seeking interpretations that might suggest appropriate ritual responses to appease whatever divine displeasure had generated these warnings. Additional human sacrifices were conducted at temples throughout the empire, while special ceremonies were organized to honor deities who might have the power to avert the predicted catastrophes. The emperor also dispatched messengers to distant oracles and shamans who possessed reputations for supernatural insight, seeking additional perspectives on the meaning of the portents and possible methods for preventing their fulfillment. These consultations produced conflicting interpretations that range from warnings of natural disasters, such as earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, to prophecies of foreign invasion and the overthrow of the imperial dynasty. The most significant of these prophetic traditions involve the expected return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity who had ruled during a golden age of peace and prosperity before departing across the eastern sea with promises to return in the year CE Acatel. According to the calculations of Aztec astronomers, the year 1519 in the European calendar corresponded to CE Acatel in the indigenous dating system, creating expectations that the god's return was imminent and that his arrival would bring fundamental changes to the existing order. The prophecies surrounding Quetzalcoatl's return described the deity as appearing in the form of a bearded, light-skinned man who would arrive from the east accompanied by followers and bearing gifts that would demonstrate his divine nature. These traditions, which had been preserved in temple schools for centuries, created a theological framework that would profoundly influence Aztec interpretations of the Spanish arrival and complicate imperial responses to the conquistadors' aggressive actions. The Spanish expedition that would forever alter the course of Mesoamerican history began not with grand imperial designs, but with the pragmatic ambitions of Cuban colonists seeking new sources of wealth and indigenous labor. Governor Diego Velázquez Cuellar had dispatched 2 previous expeditions to explore the Mexican coast. First under Francisco Hernández de Córdoba in 1517, and then under Juan Grijalva in 1518. Both ventures had returned with tantalizing reports of sophisticated civilizations, abundant gold, and densely populated cities that suggested opportunities for conquest and enrichment far exceeding anything the Spanish had encountered in the Caribbean islands. Hernán Cortés, a minor hidalgo from Extremadura, who had spent 15 years in the Caribbean establishing himself as a successful and commano and municipal official, possessed the combination of ambition, administrative experience, and political connections necessary to organize the most ambitious expedition yet attempted against the Mexican mainland. Born around 1485 in Medellin, Cortés had briefly studied law at the University of Salamanca before abandoning his education to seek his fortune in a new world. His years in Hispaniola and Cuba had taught him the intricacies of colonial administration, the importance of maintaining good relationships with indigenous allies, and the techniques required to extract maximum wealth from conquered territories. The expedition that departed Cuba in February 1519 consisted of 11 ships carrying approximately 630 Spanish soldiers, sailors, and adventurers, along with several hundred indigenous auxiliaries from the Caribbean islands who serve as interpreters, guides, and laborers. The Spanish contingent included 32 crossbowmen, 13 musketeers equipped with primitive firearms, 16 cavalrymen with their horses, and several hundred soldiers armed with steel swords, pikes, and shields. The expedition also carried 14 small cannons, including falcons and culverins that could fire stone or iron projectiles with devastating effect against indigenous warriors unaccustomed to gunpowder weapons. The technological advantages possessed by the Spanish forces extended beyond their superior metallurgy and gunpowder weapons to include innovations in military organization, logistics, and naval transportation that reflected centuries of European warfare and exploration. The steel weapons carried by Spanish soldiers maintained their sharpness far longer than obsidian implements and could penetrate the cotton armor worn by Mesoamerican warriors, while their metal helmets and breastplates provided protection against arrows and clubs that would have been lethal to unarmored opponents. The horses, unknown in the Americas before European arrival, created psychological shock among indigenous peoples while providing Spanish cavalry with unprecedented mobility and tactical flexibility. The expedition's first significant encounter with the indigenous populations of Mexico occurred along the coast of Yucatan, where Maya communities had maintained their independence despite the proximity of Spanish settlements in the Caribbean. The Maya peoples of this region had developed sophisticated urban centers, monumental architecture, and writing systems that rivaled those of central Mexico. While their experience with earlier Spanish expeditions had taught them to regard European visitors with suspicion and hostility, the initial contacts between Cortés's expedition and Maya communities followed patterns established during previous Spanish explorations with indigenous leaders attempting to assess European intentions, while Spanish commanders sought information about regional politics, resources, and potential allies or enemies. The Maya caciques who met with Spanish representatives possessed detailed knowledge of the powerful empire that controlled the Mexican highlands, having maintained trade relationships with Aztec merchants for generations and received regular visits from Paca expeditions that exchanged tropical products for highland manufacturers. These early encounters provided Cortés with crucial intelligence about the political situation in Central Mexico, including information about the tribute relationships that bound subject peoples to the Triple Alliance and the resentments that many communities harbored against Aztec rule. My informants described the magnificent capital of Tenochtitlan with its floating gardens and massive temples, the wealth that flowed into the city from throughout Mesoamerica, and the military power that enforced imperial authority over diverse populations. More importantly, they revealed the existence of indigenous groups along the Mexican coast who had resisted Aztec conquest and might welcome Spanish support against their traditional enemies. The expedition's arrival at the island of Cozumel provided Cortés with one of his most valuable assets in the form of Geronimo de Aguilar, a Spanish priest who'd been shipwrecked on the Yucatan coast 8 years earlier and had learned to speak Maya during his captivity. Aguilar's linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge proved invaluable for subsequent negotiations with indigenous leaders. While his information about Maya political organization and religious practices helped Spanish commanders develop strategies for exploiting divisions among potential enemies and allies. The Spanish landing at the mouth of the Grijalva River brought the expedition into contact with the Contella peoples of Tabasco, who controlled important trade routes between the Gulf Coast and the highland regions of central Mexico. The Chontal communities had grown wealthy through their role as intermediaries in long-distanciance commerce, collecting tolls for merchant expeditions and providing transportation services for goods moving between different ecological zones. Their strategic location and economic importance had enabled them to maintain their independence from both Maya kingdoms to the east and the Aztec Empire to the west. The Battle of Kintler fought in March 1519 demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Spanish military technology against indigenous forces while establishing patterns of warfare that would characterize the conquest period. The Chontal warriors who opposed the Spanish landing, employing in dense formations while shouting war cries and brandishing obsidian-edged weapons decorated with colorful feathers and precious stones. Their cotton armor, wooden shields, and quilted tunics provided adequate protection against indigenous weapons, but proved inadequate against Spanish steel swords and crossbow bolts. The Spanish cavalry charge that broke the Maya battle line created panic among indigenous warriors who had never encountered horses and initially believed that horse and rider formed a single supernatural creature. The thunderous noise of Spanish cannons combined with the acrid smoke of gunpowder and the screams of wounded men and animals transformed the battlefield into a scene of chaos and terror that overwhelmed traditional Maya military discipline. The Spanish victory was complete and decisive with hundreds of indigenous casualties compared to minimal losses among the European forces. The aftermath of the battle brought Cortés one of his most crucial advantages in the form of Malintzin, known to the Spanish as Dona Marina or La Maline, who would serve as interpreter, cultural advisor, and strategic partner throughout the conquest campaign. Malintzin was among 20 young women presented to the Spanish as tribute by the defeated Chao leaders. But her linguistic abilities and noble background quickly distinguished her from the other captives. Born into the Nahua-speaking nobility of central Mexico, she had been sold into slavery as a child and had learned Maya during her years of captivity in Tabasco, making her uniquely qualified to serve as a bridge between Spanish and indigenous cultures. Melintzin's role extended far beyond simple translation as she possessed intimate knowledge of Mesoamerican political systems, religious practices, and social hierarchies that enabled her to advise Spanish commanders on appropriate protocols for diplomatic negotiations and military operations. Her understanding of indigenous concepts of authority, tribute relationships, and alliance systems proved crucial for Spanish efforts to exploit divisions among potential enemies and recruit indigenous allies for the conquest campaign. The complex relationship that developed between Malintzin and Cortés involved personal, political, and strategic dimensions that would profoundly influence the course of Spanish indigenous interactions throughout the conquest period. The Spanish expedition's arrival at the Tatan city of Quempo in June 1519 provided Cortés with his first major indigenous allies and crucial intelligence about Aztec imperial administration. The Tatan peoples controlled the fertile coastal plains between the Sierra Madre Oriental and the Gulf of Mexico, a region that had been conquered by the Triple Alliance during the reign of Axayacatl and subjected to heavy tribute obligations that included cotton textiles, tropical products, and human victims for sacrificial ceremonies. The Tatan Cacique who received the Spanish expedition expressed bitter resentment against Aztec rule and eagerness to support any force capable of challenging imperial authority. The Totonac complaints against Aztec administration provided Cortés with detailed information about the tribute system that sustained the empire and the mechanisms through which imperial authority was enforced in distant provinces. Totonac leaders described the regular arrival of tribute collectors accompanied by armed guards who demanded specified quantities of goods according to schedules maintained in pictographic records. Communities that failed to meet their obligations faced military intervention with resistant leaders executed and their population subjected to punitive raids. The captured victims for sacrificial ceremonies in Tenochtitlan. The alliance between the Spanish expedition and the Tatan Confederation was formalized through ceremonies that combined European and indigenous diplomatic traditions, with Spanish commanders participating in indigenous rituals. While Totonac leaders acknowledged Spanish authority through acts of submission that resembled European feudal practices, the Totonacs provided the Spanish with thousands of indigenous warriors, detailed maps of routes to the highland regions, and logistical support that included food supplies, transportation services, and intelligence about Aztec military capabilities and political vulnerabilities. The most dramatic demonstration of this new alliance occurred when Cortés ordered his Totonite allies to arrest Aztec tribute collectors who had arrived in Quempo to demand payment of overdue obligations. This unprecedented act of defiance against imperial authority sent shock waves throughout the region while demonstrating Spanish willingness to support indigenous resistance against Aztec rule. The arrested tribute collectors were eventually released with messages from Moctezuma II, describing Spanish military capabilities and expressing desires for peaceful negotiations. But the incident had already established Cortés as a potential alternative to Aztec imperial authority. The Spanish decision to establish Villa Rica de Cruz as a permanent settlement on the Mexican coast reflected Cortés's understanding of Spanish legal traditions and his determination to legitimize his expedition through proper administrative procedures. The foundation of a municipality provided legal justification for Spanish presence in Mexico while creating governmental institutions that could issue orders, collect taxes, and conduct diplomatic negotiations with indigenous leaders. The town council elected Cortés as Captain General and Chief Justice, formally granting him the authority he needed to conduct military operations and negotiate treaties without reference to Governor Velázquez's original instructions. The destruction of the Spanish ships that had carried the expedition from Cuba eliminated any possibility of retreat, while forcing all expedition members to commit themselves fully to the conquest enterprise. This dramatic gesture, often misrepresented as the burning of the ships, actually involved the careful salvage of useful materials, including iron, sails, and cordage that were transported inland for use in subsequent military operations. The elimination of the fleet also prevented potential deserters from returning to Cuba, with reports of Spanish activities that might have prompted intervention by Governor Velázquez or other colonial authorities. The Spanish march toward Tenochtitlan began in August 1519 with a combined force of approximately 400 Spanish soldiers and several thousand Totonac warriors, following indigenous trade routes that connected the coastal regions with the highland valleys of central Mexico. The logistical challenges of moving this army across difficult terrain required careful coordination between Spanish commanders and indigenous allies who possessed detailed knowledge of local conditions, water sources, and potential hazards. The expedition carried limited supplies of European equipment and relied heavily on indigenous allies for food, shelter, and transportation services. The route chosen by Cortés led through the territory of the Tlaxcalan Confederation, a collection of 4 city-states that had maintained their independence against Aztec expansion through military prowess and strategic alliances with other enemies of the Triple Alliance. The Tlaxcalans controlled important trade routes between the Gulf Coast and the Valley of Mexico, while serving as a buffer zone that protected more distant communities from Aztec military expeditions. Their warriors had developed specialized tactics for fighting against Aztec forces and possessed detailed intelligence about imperial military organization and capabilities. The initial encounters between Spanish forces and Tlaxcalan warriors demonstrated the complex political calculations that indigenous leaders made when confronted with European military technology and alliance proposals. Tlaxcalan commanders initially treated the Spanish as potential Aztec allies and launched attacks designed to test European military capabilities while preventing any Spanish advance toward the highland regions. The fierce battles that followed revealed both the effectiveness of Spanish weapons and the courage of indigenous warriors who continued fighting despite heavy casualties inflicted by firearms, steel weapons, and cavalry charges. The Spanish victory over Tlaxcalan forces at the Battle of Tacco in September 1519 resulted from the devastating combination of European military technology and indigenous auxiliary forces who understood local terrain and fighting conditions. Spanish cavalry charges broke Tlaxcalan battle lines, while crossbowmen and musketeers provided covering fire that prevented indigenous forces from regrouping for counterattacks. The Totonac warriors who fought alongside the Spanish demonstrated their value as allies by pursuing fleeing enemies and providing intelligence about Tlaxcalan defensive positions and strategic resources. The aftermath of this military defeat prompted intensive debates within Tlaxcalan leadership councils about appropriate responses to Spanish military superiority and alliance proposals. The younger war leaders who had advocated continued resistance found their positions undermined by the casualties suffered in battle and the obvious effectiveness of Spanish weapons against traditional indigenous military tactics. Older nobles who had opposed war with the Spanish gained influence within the Confederation's governing councils and began negotiations that would transform the Tlaxcalans from enemies into the most important indigenous allies of the conquest campaign. The Spanish entry into the city of Tlaxcala in September 1519 marked a crucial turning point in the conquest campaign as Cortés gained access to the largest indigenous military force in central Mexico, while the Tlaxcalans acquired European allies capable of challenging Aztec imperial dominance. The negotiations that formalized this alliance required careful attention to the diplomatic protocols and ceremonial requirements that governed indigenous political relationships, with Spanish commanders participating in elaborate rituals that confirmed their status as honored guests and potential military partners. The Tlaxcalan Confederation provided the Spanish expedition with approximately 6,000 warriors, detailed intelligence about Aztec military capabilities and political vulnerabilities, and logistical support that included food supplies, weapons, and transportation services for the march to Tenochtitlan. More importantly, the Tlaxcalan alliance demonstrated to other indigenous communities that Spanish military technology could provide effective protection against Aztec retaliation while offering opportunities to overthrow the tribute relationships that had enriched the Triple Alliance at the expense of subject peoples. The Spanish massacre at Cholula in October 1519 revealed the brutal methods that European commanders were prepared to employ against indigenous communities suspected of treachery or resistance. Cholula was one of the most important religious centers in Mesoamerica, with massive temple complexes that attracted pilgrims from throughout the region and a population of skilled craftsmen who produced luxury goods for noble households across central Mexico. The city's rulers had submitted to Spanish authority and provided supplies for the expedition. But Cortez received warnings from Tlaxcalan allies and Malinsun that Colulan leaders were planning an ambush in coordination with Aztec forces. The preemptive attack ordered by Cortez resulted in the deaths of thousands of Colulan civilians and the destruction of major portions of the city, including several important temples that were demolished to provide materials for a Catholic church who were constructed on the site of the main pyramid. The massacre served as a demonstration of Spanish military capabilities while warning other indigenous communities about the consequences of resistance or betrayal. The psychological impact of the Cholula massacre extended far beyond the immediate vicinity as reports of Spanish brutality spread throughout central Mexico and influenced subsequent indigenous responses to European demands and alliance proposals. News of the Spanish advance toward Tenochtitlan reached Moctezuma II through the extensive intelligence networks that connected the imperial capital with distant provinces and allied city-states. The emperor's initial responses reflected the complex mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and religious speculation that characterized elite Aztec reactions to reports of European arrival and activities. The technological superiority demonstrated by Spanish forces, combined with their association with indigenous enemies of the empire, suggested that these foreigners represented a significant threat to imperial authority and territorial integrity. The gifts sent by Moctezuma II to the Spanish expedition included magnificent examples of Aztec craftsmanship designed to demonstrate imperial wealth and artistic sophistication. While potentially satisfying European desires for precious materials, the treasure included elaborate featherwork headdresses, golden ornaments depicting Aztec deities, jade jewelry, and cotton textiles decorated with complex patterns that required years of skilled labor to complete. These diplomatic presents reflected traditional Mesoamerican practices of gift exchange between rulers while attempting to establish peaceful relationships that might prevent military conflict. The Spanish reception of these gifts revealed fundamental misunderstandings about indigenous political systems and diplomatic protocols that would complicate subsequent negotiations between European and Aztec representatives. Spanish commanders interpreted the valuable presents as evidence of vast wealth awaiting conquest, rather than as diplomatic overtures requiring reciprocal gestures of respect and friendship. The European focus on the precious metals contained in Aztec gifts, combined with their dismissal of the artistic and religious significance of featherwork and textile components, demonstrated cultural incomprehension that made meaningful diplomatic resolution increasingly unlikely. The emperor's decision to receive the Spanish expedition in Tenochtitlan reflected complex calculations about military capabilities, religious obligations, and political necessities that remained subjects of historical debate. Moctezuma II possessed detailed intelligence about Spanish military technology and indigenous alliance systems, while also confronting the theological implications of prophecies concerning Quetzalcoatl's return and the potential divine nature of the European visitors. The emperor's religious training and ceremonial responsibilities required him to consider supernatural explanations for unprecedented events, while his political experience demanded realistic assessments of military threats and diplomatic opportunities. The Spanish entry into Tenochtitlan on November 8, 1519 represented one of the most extraordinary encounters in human history. As representatives of two completely separate civilizational traditions met in the magnificent capital of the most powerful empire in Mesoamerica. The Spanish soldiers who crossed the causeway from the mainland to the island city found themselves surrounded by architectural marvels, engineering achievements, and artistic creations that challenged European assumptions about indigenous capabilities while demonstrating the wealth and sophistication of Aztec civilization. The initial meeting between Cortez and Moctezuma II occurred according to indigenous ceremonial protocols that emphasized the divine nature of rulership and the sacred obligations that govern interactions between political authorities. The emperor carried on a golden litter and shaded by a canopy of precious feathers. Wore garments that incorporated the finest materials available in Mesoamerica, while his attendants performed rituals that acknowledged his status as the earthly representative of the gods. The Spanish captain general, dressed in his finest European clothing and accompanied by his most trusted officers, attempted to reciprocate these ceremonial gestures while maintaining the dignity appropriate to his position as leader of a sovereign expedition. The Spanish accommodation in the palace of Aztec provided European visitors with unprecedented access to the inner workings of Aztec imperial administration, while placing them in a position of potential vulnerability within the heart of enemy territory. The palace complex included residential quarters for the Spanish soldiers, stables for their horses, and storage areas for their equipment and supplies, while also providing opportunities for observation and intelligence gathering about Aztec military capabilities, political organization, and economic resources. The weeks following the Spanish arrival in Tenochtitlan witnessed a complex series of negotiations, ceremonies, and misunderstandings that reflected the fundamental incompatibility between European and indigenous concepts of political authority, religious obligation, and territorial sovereignty. Spanish demands for tribute payments, religious conversion, and political submission conflicted with Aztec expectations of diplomatic reciprocity, cultural respect, and recognition of imperial authority. The presence of Spanish soldiers within the ceremonial center of the empire created unprecedented tensions that challenged traditional protocols while raising questions about appropriate responses to foreign military power. The arrest of Moctezuma II by Spanish forces in November 1519 represented a desperate attempt by Cortés to maintain control over an increasingly dangerous situation through the manipulation of indigenous political institutions and religious beliefs. The seizure of the emperor violated fundamental principles of Aztec political theory while demonstrating Spanish willingness to employ extreme measures to achieve their objectives. The emperor's captivity created a constitutional crisis within the imperial government while undermining the religious foundations of Aztec authority and territorial control. The massacre at the Templar during the Festival of Tuscada in May 1520 marked the definitive breakdown of Spanish-Aztec relations and the beginning of the violent confrontation that would determine the fate of the empire. Pedro de Alvarado left in command of Tenochtitlan, while Cortés dealt with a rival Spanish expedition on the coast, ordered his soldiers to attack Aztec nobles who were participating in traditional religious ceremonies within the main temple complex. The Spanish assault killed hundreds of unarmed participants, including many of the most important political and religious leaders in the empire, while desecrating the sacred spaces that form the spiritual center of Aztec civilization. The indigenous uprising that followed the Templar massacre reflected the accumulated resentments and religious outrage that had been building since the Spanish arrival in the capital. Aztec warriors, coordinated by surviving members of the Imperial Council, launched coordinated attacks against Spanish positions while cutting the causeways that connected the island city to the mainland. The siege of the Spanish positions in Cuddle's palace demonstrated indigenous capabilities for sustained military operations while revealing the vulnerability of European forces when deprived of their mobility and logistical advantages. The death of Moctezuma II during the uprising remains one of the most controversial events of the conquest period, with Spanish and indigenous sources providing conflicting accounts of the circumstances and responsibility for the emperor's demise. Spanish chronicles claimed that the emperor was killed by stones thrown by his own subjects when he attempted to address the crowd and restore order, while indigenous accounts suggested that Spanish soldiers murdered their captive when his usefulness as a puppet ruler had ended. The emperor's death eliminated any possibility of negotiated settlement, while creating a succession crisis that further destabilized imperial authority during the military confrontation. Llano Trist, the Night of Sorrows of June 30th, 1520 witnessed the Spanish retreat from Tenochtitlan under cover of darkness as Cortés attempted to evacuate his forces before the Aztec siege could completely eliminate European military capabilities. The Spanish column, burdened with treasure looted from imperial palaces and temples, attempted to cross the Western Causeway while under constant attack from Aztec warriors in war canoes who'd anticipated the escape attempt. The retreat became a rout as Spanish soldiers weighed down by gold and silver drowned in the lake, while indigenous allies were overwhelmed by superior numbers of enemy forces. The casualties suffered during Leno Trist reduced Spanish military strength by more than half, while eliminating many of the indigenous allies who had provided crucial support for European operations throughout central Mexico. The survivors who reached the safety of Tlaxcalan territory faced the daunting prospect of rebuilding their forces while confronting an emboldened Aztec Empire that had demonstrated its capacity to defeat European military technology through coordinated resistance and superior numbers. The treasure that had motivated Spanish participation in the conquest enterprise now lay scattered across the lake bottom, while the indigenous allies who'd provided crucial intelligence and logistical support questioned their commitment to a cause that appeared increasingly hopeless. The succession of Cuauhtémoc to the position of Watonwani in early 1521 marked a fundamental transformation in Aztec leadership philosophy and military strategy during the empire's final crisis. Unlike his predecessors who had attempted to accommodate Spanish demands through negotiation and compromise, Cuauhtémoc represented the militant faction within the imperial nobility that advocated total war against the European invaders and their indigenous allies. Born around 1495, the new emperor was approximately 26 years old when he assumed power, making him the youngest ruler in Aztec history and a leader whose entire adult experience had been shaped by the crisis of foreign invasion and imperial collapse. Cuauhtémoc's elevation to supreme authority occurred through the traditional electoral process conducted by the Imperial Council. But the circumstances surrounding his selection reflected the desperate military situation facing the empire. The devastating epidemic of smallpox that had swept through central Mexico during 1520 and early 1521 had killed enormous numbers of indigenous people, including Cuitlao, Moctezuma II's successor, who had ruled for only 80 days before succumbing to the disease. The epidemic had also eliminated many of the experienced administrators, military commanders, and religious leaders who normally would have provided continuity during dynastic transitions. The new emperor's first priority involved reorganizing the empire's military forces to confront the Spanish threat more effectively than his predecessors had managed. Cuauhtémoc possessed extensive battlefield experience from campaigns against Tlaxcalan forces and other enemies of the Triple Alliance. While his youth and energy enabled him to maintain the grueling schedule of military planning, diplomatic negotiations, and religious ceremonies required during wartime. His elevation to power coincided with the arrival of reinforcements from throughout the empire as tributary communities responded to imperial summons despite the disruptions caused by epidemic disease and military mobilization. The emperor's military strategy emphasized the advantages that indigenous forces possessed in the unique environment of the Valley of Mexico, particularly their superior knowledge of local terrain and their ability to coordinate operations across the complex system of lakes, islands, and causeways that characterize the region. Cuauhtémoc recognized that Spanish cavalry and artillery were most effective in open terrain where their mobility and firepower could be fully utilized, while the confined spaces of urban warfare and the aquatic environment of the lake system neutralized many European tactical advantages. The fortification of Tenochtitlan under Wok's direction transformed the island capital into a fortress capable of withstanding prolonged siege warfare, while maintaining the logistical capabilities necessary to support large numbers of defenders. The emperor ordered the construction of additional defensive works along the causeways, including stone barriers, earthworks, and concealed positions for archers and spear throwers who could attack enemy forces attempting to approach the city. The canal system that had originally been designed to facilitate transportation and drainage was modified to create defensive obstacles that would channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The most significant modifications involved the systematic destruction of bridges along the causeways, creating gaps that could only be crossed by swimming or by using portable bridges that attacking forces would have to carry with them. These gaps were covered by carefully positioned warriors armed with bows, atlatls, and slings who could inflict heavy casualties on exposed enemies attempting to cross the water. The defensive positions were supplied with large quantities of stones, arrows, and other projectiles that had been stockpiled throughout the city during the months preceding the final siege. The emperor's diplomatic efforts focused on maintaining the loyalty of tributary communities and allied city-states, whose continued support was essential for the empire's survival. Quoc dispatched messengers throughout Mesoamerica, carrying appeals for military assistance and warnings about the consequences of Spanish victory for all indigenous peoples. These diplomatic missions emphasized the religious and cultural threats posed by European conquest, particularly the Spanish destruction of temples and sacred objects that formed the spiritual foundation of Mesoamerican civilization. The response to these imperial appeals varied considerably, depending on local political circumstances and previous experiences with Spanish forces. Communities that had suffered under heavy tribute obligations or had been recently conquered showed little enthusiasm for defending an empire that had oppressed them, while regions that had maintained traditional alliances with a triple alliance provided substantial military support, despite the risks involved. The city-state of Texcoco, one of the original members of the Triple Alliance, experienced internal divisions as some nobles supported continued resistance, while others advocated accommodation with Spanish demands. The epidemic diseases that had preceded and accompanied Spanish conquest efforts created demographic catastrophes that fundamentally altered the balance of power between European and indigenous forces. Smallpox, typhus, and other Old World diseases to which Native American populations had no immunity killed enormous numbers of people throughout central Mexico, with mortality rates in some communities reaching 50% or higher. The epidemic not only reduced the absolute numbers of potential warriors available for imperial defense, but also disrupted the social and political institutions that coordinated military resistance. The disease outbreaks affected indigenous and Spanish forces differently, creating significant advantages for European military operations. While Spanish soldiers possess some immunity to Old World diseases through previous exposure, indigenous warriors had no protection against these new pathogens and continued to sicken and die throughout the siege period. The epidemics also disrupted agricultural production and food distribution systems, creating shortages that weakened defender morale and reduced their capacity for sustained resistance. Cuauhtémoc's efforts to maintain fighting effectiveness despite these demographic losses required innovative approaches to military organization and recruitment. The emperor expanded the traditional warrior societies to include younger men and older veterans who normally would not have participated in major campaigns, while also incorporating women into defensive activities, such as supplying ammunition, treating wounded fighters, and maintaining fortifications. The breakdown of normal social hierarchies during the crisis enabled greater participation by commoners in military planning and leadership roles previously reserved for the nobility. The Spanish siege strategy developed by Cortés during his months of preparation in Tlaxcalan territory reflected lessons learned from the disastrous retreat of Llano Triste and the military capabilities that indigenous forces had demonstrated during the uprising of 1520. The Spanish commander recognized that direct assault against Tenochtitlan's fortifications would result in prohibitive casualties while failing to achieve decisive results, making it necessary to develop alternative approaches that could exploit European technological advantages while minimizing indigenous defensive strengths. The construction of brigantines represented the most innovative aspect of Spanish siege preparations, as these shallow draft vessels would enable European forces to control the lake system that formed the foundation of Tenochtitlan's defensive strategy. The ships were built in Tlaxcala using timber cut in the mountains surrounding the valley and transported by thousands of indigenous allies who had committed themselves to Spanish victory. The vessels incorporated European shipbuilding techniques, while being specifically designed for the unique conditions of Lake Texcoco, with shallow drafts that enabled them to operate in the reed beds and marshy areas where traditional European ships could not function. Each brigantine measured approximately 12 m in length and carried a crew of Spanish sailors supported by indigenous rowers who provided the manpower necessary for sustained operations. The vessels were armed with small cannons and swivel guns that could fire grape shot or solid projectiles against enemy canoes and defensive positions, while the elevated decks provided platforms for crossbowmen and musketeers who could engage targets at longer ranges than ground-based forces. The psychological impact of these floating fortresses proved as important as their tactical capabilities, as indigenous defenders had never encountered waterborne artillery platforms and initially found them terrifying and supernatural. The Spanish alliance system that supported the siege of Tenochtitlan represented one of the most successful examples of European indigenous cooperation during the conquest period, as tens of thousands of native warriors joined Spanish forces in attacking the Aztec capital. The Tlaxcalan Confederation provided the largest contingent of allied forces, contributing approximately 50,000 warriors who brought their own weapons, supplies, and military leadership to the campaign. These fighters possessed extensive experience in warfare against Aztec forces and understood the tactical challenges involved in attacking fortified positions within the lake system. Additional indigenous allies joined the siege forces from throughout central Mexico, including communities that had recently thrown off Aztec rule and others that sought to position themselves advantageously for the post-conquest period. The city-states of Texcoco and Chalco provided thousands of warriors along with canoes and naval expertise that proved crucial for operations in the aquatic environment surrounding Tenochtitlan. The participation of these former members of the Triple Alliance demonstrated the complete collapse of imperial unity and the success of Spanish efforts to exploit political divisions within the Aztec Confederation. The logistical challenges involved in maintaining siege forces numbering over 100,000 men required unprecedented coordination between Spanish commanders and indigenous allies who provided the organizational capabilities necessary for such massive operations. The Allied forces established camps around the perimeter of Lake Texcoco, with each contingent responsible for specific sectors of the siege lines and particular tactical objectives within the overall campaign strategy. Supply lines stretching back to Tlaxcala and other Allied territories provided food, weapons, and replacement personnel forces that suffered casualties during the prolonged siege operations. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in earnest during May 1521 with coordinated attacks against the causeways that connected the island capital to the mainland. Spanish forces supported by their indigenous allies launched simultaneous assaults against the northern, western, and southern approaches to the city, while the brigantines established control over the lake waters that had previously provided security for the Aztec defenders. The initial phases of the siege focused on capturing and holding positions along the causeways that would enable the attackers to advance gradually toward the city center. The fighting along the causeways proved exceptionally brutal and costly for both sides, as the confined spaces prevented the effective use of Spanish cavalry while enabling Aztec defenders to concentrate their missile fire against exposed attacking forces. The stone barriers and earthworks constructed by Quemox engineers channeled Spanish advances into predetermined killing zones, where crossbow bolts and arquebus balls provided limited advantages against indigenous warriors fighting for prepared positions. The gaps created by destroyed bridges forced Spanish soldiers to expose themselves while attempting to cross water obstacles under constant fire from concealed defenders. The Spanish capture of Xoloc, a fortified position controlling the southern causeway, provided the attackers with their first major tactical success and demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated operations involving European technology and indigenous allies. The assault on this strategic position required the combined efforts of Spanish infantry, artillery, and indigenous warriors who overwhelmed the defenders through superior numbers and firepower. The fall of Xoloc enabled Spanish forces to establish a permanent foothold on the southern causeway, while cutting off one of the routes that Aztec forces had used to resupply their defensive positions. The systematic destruction of Tenochtitlan's urban infrastructure became a central component of Spanish siege strategy as Cortés recognized that the city's complex architecture and engineering systems provided numerous advantages for the defenders. The Spanish commander ordered the demolition of buildings, temples, and other structures that could serve as defensive positions or provide cover for Aztec warriors, while also destroying the aqueducts and canal systems that supplied fresh water to the city's population. This scorched earth approach created significant hardships for the civilian population while reducing the tactical advantages that indigenous forces derived from their intimate knowledge of urban terrain. The destruction of Aztec temples and religious monuments served both tactical and ideological purposes within Spanish siege strategy, as these structures provided elevated positions for defenders, while also representing the spiritual foundation of indigenous resistance. Spanish soldiers systematically demolished pyramid temples throughout the city, using the stone blocks to fill canals and create roadways that enable the movement of artillery and supplies. The destruction of religious sites also fulfilled Spanish obligations to eliminate what they considered idolatrous practices while demonstrating European power to indigenous observers throughout the region. The Spanish burning of codices and other written materials represented one of the most devastating cultural losses of the conquest period, as these pictographic documents contain centuries of accumulated knowledge about Aztec history, religion, science, and administration. Spanish soldiers and their indigenous allies destroyed thousands of bark paper books during their advance through the city, viewing these materials as instruments of diabolic influence that needed to be eliminated to ensure complete victory over indigenous culture. The loss of these irreplaceable documents created gaps in historical knowledge that continue to limit modern understanding of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican civilization. The siege's impact on Tenochtitlan's civilian population created humanitarian disasters that influenced the course of military operations and the ultimate outcome of the campaign. The Spanish blockade of the city prevented the importation of food supplies from the mainland, while the destruction of Chinampus and other agricultural facilities within the urban area eliminated local food production. The combination of military action and epidemic disease created conditions of extreme hardship for non-combatants who found themselves trapped within the besieged city without adequate supplies of food, water, or medical care. Cartmach's efforts to maintain civilian morale and military effectiveness despite these deteriorating conditions demonstrated remarkable leadership capabilities and personal courage that earned respect even from his Spanish enemies. The emperor continued to appear in public ceremonies and military planning sessions despite the obvious dangers involved, while also participating directly in combat operations that exposed him to the same risks faced by ordinary warriors. His visible presence during the most difficult phases of the siege provided psychological support for defenders who might otherwise have lost hope in the face of overwhelming odds. The emperor's decision to continue resistance despite offers of negotiated surrender reflected both personal conviction and strategic calculation about the likely consequences of Spanish victory. Cuauhtémoc understood from previous Spanish actions that submission would not necessarily protect indigenous populations from violence, exploitation, or cultural destruction. making continued resistance appear preferable to surrender even under desperate circumstances. The emperor's determination to fight to the end also reflected traditional Aztec concepts of honor and duty that required rulers to sacrifice themselves for their people's welfare. The Spanish capture of Tlatelolco in early August 1521 marked the beginning of the final phase of the siege, as Aztec forces were compressed into an increasingly small area within the southern portion of Tenochtitlan. The fall of the Great Market Center eliminated one of the last sources of supplies for the defenders, while providing Spanish forces with a secure base for launching final assaults against the remaining Aztec positions. The psychological impact of losing Tlatelolco was enormous for indigenous morale, as this commercial center had served as a symbol of Aztec prosperity and cultural achievement for generations. The fighting during the final weeks of the siege reached levels of intensity and brutality that shocked even experienced Spanish veterans who had participated in European wars and previous American conquests. Aztec warriors facing certain death or enslavement fought with desperate courage in hand-to-hand combat that often continued for hours in individual buildings and courtyards. Spanish soldiers found themselves engaged in urban warfare that negated many of their technological advantages, while exposing them to constant danger from hidden defenders who emerged from concealed positions to attack isolated groups of enemies. The capture of Carter on August 13th, 1521 occurred during the emperor's attempt to escape from the fallen city in a war canoe accompanied by his family and closest advisors. Spanish brigantines patrolling the lake intercepted the imperial party as they attempted to reach the mainland, where loyal forces might have enabled continued resistance from mountain strongholds. The emperor's capture eliminated the last legitimate source of imperial authority while providing Spanish forces with a valuable prisoner whose cooperation might facilitate the pacification of remaining Aztec territories. The Spanish treatment of Cuauhtémoc following his capture reflected the complex mixture of respect, suspicion, and pragmatic calculation that characterized European attitudes toward indigenous leaders during the conquest period. Cortés initially treated the captured emperor with courtesy appropriate to his royal status, providing him with adequate housing and allowing him to maintain some ceremonial privileges while attempting to secure his cooperation in ending indigenous resistance. However, Spanish suspicions about hidden treasure and potential rebellion led to increasingly harsh treatment that culminated in the emperor's torture and eventual execution. The systematic torture of cult and other captured Aztec nobles represented one of the most shameful episodes of the conquest period, as Spanish soldiers attempted to force their prisoners to reveal the locations of hidden treasure that they believed must exist within the fallen city. The emperor and his companions were subjected to having their feet burned with oil and other forms of physical abuse, designed to break their resistance and extract information about imperial wealth. These brutal interrogations failed to produce significant additional treasure while demonstrating Spanish willingness to employ extreme violence against even the highest-ranking indigenous prisoners. The execution of Cuauhtémoc in 1525 during Cortés's expedition to Honduras eliminated the last legitimate claimant to Aztec imperial authority while sending a clear message to indigenous populations throughout Mesoamerica about the consequences of continued resistance to Spanish rule. The emperor was hanged along with other Aztec nobles on charges of plotting rebellion against Spanish authority, though the evidence for such conspiracy remains questionable and may have been fabricated to justify the elimination of potential sources of indigenous leadership. The death of Cuauhtémoc marked the definitive end of the Aztec Empire and the beginning of the colonial period that would transform Mesoamerican society over the following 3 centuries. The establishment of Spanish colonial administration in the former Aztec territories required the creation of new governmental institutions that could manage the complex challenges of ruling diverse indigenous populations while extracting maximum economic benefit for Spanish colonists and the crown. The encomienda system granted Spanish colonists the right to collect tribute and labor from specific indigenous communities in exchange for providing protection and religious instruction. Though in practice, this arrangement often resembled slavery and resulted in severe exploitation of native populations. The Spanish colonial government also established new legal codes, administrative procedures, and religious institutions that systematically replaced indigenous systems of governance and cultural practice. The transformation of Tenochtitlan into Mexico City began immediately following the Spanish conquest, as Hernán Cortés recognized the strategic advantages of maintaining the former Aztec capital as the center of colonial administration. The island city's location at the heart of the Valley of Mexico's transportation networks, its access to abundant fresh water through the existing aqueduct systems, and its symbolic importance as the seat of indigenous imperial power made it the logical choice for the vice-regal capital. However, the extensive destruction caused during the siege required massive reconstruction efforts that would fundamentally alter the urban landscape, while incorporating Spanish architectural styles and urban planning principles into the framework of the pre-existing Aztec city. The establishment of the Viceroyalty of New Spain in 1535 formalized the administrative structure that would govern the former Aztec territories for the next 3 centuries. Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza arrived in Mexico City with comprehensive instruction from the Spanish crown regarding the organization of colonial government, the extraction of wealth from indigenous populations, and the implementation of Catholic evangelization programs designed to eliminate pre-Columbian religious practices. The vice-regal palace was constructed on the site of Moctezum's former residence, symbolically asserting Spanish authority over the physical and political spaces that had once housed Aztec imperial power. The Spanish colonial administration built upon many of the administrative innovations that had enabled the Aztec Empire to govern diverse populations across vast territories. The tribute collection systems developed by Aztec bureaucrats were adapted to serve Spanish colonial needs, with indigenous communities required to deliver specified quantities of goods and labor to colonial authorities according to schedules that resembled pre-conquest obligations. The Calpulli system of neighborhood organization was maintained, but modified to facilitate Spanish control with indigenous leaders, serving as intermediaries between colonial administrators and native communities, while losing much of their traditional autonomy and authority. The encomendanda grants that distributed indigenous communities among Spanish colonists represented a fundamental transformation of the tribute relationships that had characterized the Aztec Empire. Unlike the Aztec system, which had allowed conquered peoples to maintain their traditional rulers and cultural practices while meeting imperial tribute obligations, the encomienda system placed indigenous communities under the direct control of Spanish and comuneros who possessed extensive powers over their assigned populations. These colonial grants included the right to collect tribute, demand labor services, and oversee the religious instruction of indigenous peoples, creating opportunities for exploitation that often exceeded the burdens imposed by pre-conquest imperial administration. The survival of Natal as a spoken language throughout central Mexico demonstrated the resilience of indigenous cultural traditions despite the devastating impacts of conquest and colonization. Spanish colonial authorities initially encouraged the use of Natal as a lingua franca for communication with diverse indigenous populations, leading to the development of standardized writing systems that enable the production of Christian texts, legal documents, and administrative records in the native language. Franciscan missionaries like Bernardino de Sahagun worked with indigenous scholars to create comprehensive dictionaries and grammars that preserve detailed knowledge of pre-conquest Natal literature, historical traditions, and religious practices. The persistence of Nahuatl-speaking communities throughout the colonial period enabled the transmission of cultural knowledge that had survived the destruction of pictographic codices and the suppression of traditional religious ceremonies. Indigenous families continue to pass down oral traditions that preserved memories of pre-conquest history, mythology, and social customs, while also adapting these cultural elements to accommodate the requirements of Spanish colonial rule and Catholic religious practice. The language itself evolved to incorporate Spanish loan words and grammatical structures, while maintaining its essential character as the primary means of communication for millions of indigenous people. Agricultural practices developed during the Aztec period continued to form the foundation of food production throughout central Mexico. Though Spanish colonization introduced new crops, animals, and farming techniques that significantly altered traditional agricultural systems, the Chinamp farming method pioneered in the lakes surrounding Tenochtitlan remained in use throughout the colonial period, providing fresh vegetables and flowers for Mexico City's growing population while demonstrating the continued effectiveness of indigenous agricultural innovations. As Spanish colonists recognized the productivity advantages of Chinampus and incorporated these artificial islands into colonial agricultural systems. Though the introduction of European crops and farming methods gradually modified traditional cultivation practices, the introduction of European domesticated animals, particularly cattle, horses, and pigs, created new opportunities for indigenous farmers while also disrupting traditional agricultural systems that had been optimized for crops rather than livestock. Indigenous communities adapted their farming practices to accommodate these new animals, developing integrated agricultural systems that combine traditional crop cultivation with European-style animal husbandry. The adoption of iron tools and plows introduced by Spanish colonists increased agricultural productivity while reducing the labor requirements for field preparation and cultivation. Traditional craft production techniques survived the conquest period and continued to influence colonial manufacturing, though Spanish demand for European-style goods and the introduction of new materials and tools significantly modified indigenous artisanal practices. Indigenous craftsmen maintained their expertise in textile production, pottery making, and metalworking while adapting their skills to produce goods that met colonial market demands and Spanish aesthetic preferences. The featherware traditions that had created some of the most spectacular examples of Aztec art continued during the early colonial period, with indigenous artisans producing elaborate religious ornaments for Catholic churches and ceremonial garments for Spanish colonial officials. The Spanish colonial government established guilds that regulated craft production and controlled access to raw materials, creating new organizational structures that replaced the hereditary craft specializations that had characterized pre-conquest artisanal production. Indigenous craftsmen were required to obtain licenses and follow Spanish regulations regarding product quality, pricing, and distribution, while also competing with Spanish artisans who possessed advantages in accessing imported materials and serving elite colonial markets. Despite these challenges, indigenous craft traditions persisted and evolved, incorporating European techniques and materials while maintaining distinctive aesthetic characteristics that reflected pre-conquest cultural values. Religious syncretism represented one of the most complex and enduring aspects of cultural adaptation following the Spanish conquest, as indigenous populations developed innovative approaches to reconciling traditional spiritual practices with the requirements of Catholic orthodoxy. The Virgin of Guadalupe, whose apparition to the indigenous peasant Juan Diego in 1531 occurred at the site of a former temple dedicated to the Aztec goddess Tunsun, became the most prominent example of this religious fusion. The cult of Guadalupe incorporated indigenous symbolic elements, including the goddess's brown skin, her association with flowers and natural fertility, and her appearance to an indigenous rather than Spanish recipient, while conforming to Catholic theological requirements regarding divine revelation and miraculous intervention. Indigenous communities throughout central Mexico developed similar syncretic religious practices that preserved elements of pre-conquest spiritual traditions within the framework of Catholic worship. Traditional deities were reinterpreted as Christian saints with similar attributes and responsibilities, while indigenous ceremonies were modified to incorporate Catholic rituals and symbols. The construction of Catholic churches on the sites of former Aztec temples created physical continuities that enabled indigenous populations to maintain spiritual connections to sacred locations while participating in Christian religious observances. The preservation of indigenous religious practices required careful negotiation between native communities and Spanish colonial authorities who were committed to eliminating what they considered idolatrous and diabolic traditions. Indigenous religious leaders developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining traditional spiritual practices while avoiding persecution by colonial officials, including the creation of hidden shrines, the use of coded symbols in Christian art, and the development of dual religious systems that operated simultaneously within indigenous communities. These adaptive strategies enabled the survival of core elements of pre-conquest religious traditions while demonstrating the flexibility and resilience of indigenous cultural systems. The rediscovery of Aztec archaeological sites began during the late colonial period, but accelerated dramatically following Mexican independence as scholars and government officials sought to establish national cultural identities that incorporated pre-Columbian heritage. The accidental discovery of the Coatlicue statue in 1790 during construction work in Mexico City's main plaza provided the first major example of monumental Aztec sculpture to receive scholarly attention. Though colonial authorities initially ordered the statue re-eared due to concerns about its potential impact on indigenous religious practices, the calendar stone discovered during the same construction project attracted international attention and became one of the most recognizable symbols of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican achievement. Systematic archaeological investigation of Aztec sites began during the 19th century as Mexican scholars and international researchers developed scientific approaches to studying pre-Columbian civilizations. The work of scholars like Antonio Garcia Cubas and Francisco del Paso Trenoso established methodological foundations for archaeological research while creating comprehensive catalogs of Aztec artifacts and architectural remains. These early investigations focused primarily on monumental architecture and spectacular artifacts, though they also began the process of documenting the complex urban systems and engineering achievements that had characterized the Aztec capital. The excavation of the Templo Mayor, beginning with limited investigations in the early 20th century and culminating in the comprehensive archaeological project initiated in 1978, revolutionized understanding of Aztec religious practices, urban development, and imperial administration. The discovery of the Coil Saki stone in 1978 during utility construction work in downtown Mexico City prompted the Mexican government to authorize extensive excavations that revealed multiple construction phases of the Great Temple, along with thousands of artifacts that provided detailed information about Aztec ritual practices, trade relationships, and artistic achievements. The Templar excavations uncovered evidence of the elaborate offering ceremonies that had accompanied each phase of the temple's construction, with caches containing thousands of objects including jade ornaments, obsidian knives, coral shells, and the remains of sacrificial victims from throughout Mesoamerica. These archaeological discoveries confirmed many of the descriptions found in Spanish colonial sources, while also revealing aspects of Aztec religious practice that had not been documented in written records. The project established new standards for urban archaeology while demonstrating the potential for recovering detailed information about pre-Columbian civilizations through systematic scientific investigation. Ongoing archaeological research in Mexico City continues to reveal new information about Aztec urban planning, engineering systems, and daily life through excavations conducted during construction projects and dedicated research initiatives. The discovery of additional temple structures, residential compounds, and specialized workshops has provided comprehensive information about the organization of the Aztec capital. while also revealing the extent to which modern Mexico City overlies the remains of Tenochtitlan. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive archaeological techniques have enabled researchers to map buried structures without extensive excavation, creating detailed plans of the pre-conquest city that inform both scholarly research and urban planning decisions. The influence of Aztec civilization on Mexican national identity became particularly pronounced following the Mexican Revolution of 1910 as political leaders sought to create unifying cultural symbols that could transcend regional and class divisions while distinguishing Mexican identity from European colonial heritage. The adoption of the Aztec eagle and serpent symbol as the central element of the Mexican flag represented the most visible expression of this cultural nationalism. While government-sponsored art projects incorporated Aztec themes and motifs into public buildings, monuments, and educational materials designed to promote national unity and cultural pride. The muralist movement, led by artists like Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Squaros, created powerful visual narratives that portrayed Aztec civilization as the foundation of Mexican national identity while criticizing Spanish colonialism and its continuing social and economic impacts. These monumental artworks displayed in prominent public buildings throughout Mexico presented idealized versions of pre-Columbian life that emphasized indigenous achievements in agriculture, architecture, and social organization while portraying the Spanish conquest as a traumatic interruption of natural cultural development. The muralists' work influenced popular understanding of Mexican history while establishing artistic traditions that continue to shape contemporary Mexican cultural expression. Educational reforms implemented during the 20th century incorporated comprehensive instruction about pre-Columbian civilizations into Mexican school curricula, ensuring that successive generations of students learned about Aztec achievements in mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and artistic production. These educational initiatives sought to counter the negative stereotypes about indigenous peoples that had been promoted during the colonial period while fostering appreciation for the sophisticated cultural traditions that had characterized pre-conquest Mesoamerica. The inclusion of Nahuatl language instruction in some school systems reflected broader efforts to preserve and revitalize indigenous cultural traditions within the framework of modern Mexican national identity. Contemporary indigenous rights movements throughout Mexico have drawn inspiration from Aztec political and cultural traditions while advocating for the recognition of indigenous land rights, cultural autonomy, and political representation. Organizations like the Zapatista Army of National Liberation have explicitly referenced pre-Columbian political concepts and symbols in their struggles for indigenous self-determination, while also developing innovative approaches to community governance that incorporate traditional decision-making processes within modern political frameworks. These movements have contributed to broader international discussions about indigenous rights and cultural preservation, while demonstrating the continuing relevance of pre-Columbian political and social traditions. The global understanding of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican achievements has been fundamentally transformed by archaeological research and scholarly analysis that has revealed the sophistication of Aztec urban planning, agricultural systems, and administrative institutions. International recognition of Aztec accomplishments in mathematics, astronomy, and engineering has contributed to broader appreciation for indigenous intellectual traditions. While challenging European-centered narratives about technological and cultural development, museums throughout the world now display Aztec artifacts and provide educational programs that emphasize the innovative character of pre-Columbian civilizations and their contributions to human cultural heritage. The influence of Aztec architectural and artistic traditions continues to be visible in contemporary Mexican and international design, with modern architects and artists incorporating pre-Columbian motifs, spatial concepts, and construction techniques into buildings, sculptures, and decorative arts. The geometric patterns, symbolic imagery, and monumental scale that characterized Aztec artistic production have inspired countless contemporary works, while also influencing urban planning projects that seek to create public spaces reflecting indigenous cultural values and aesthetic principles. The legacy of the Aztec Empire extends far beyond its historical significance as a pre-Columbian political entity, encompassing continuing influences on language, culture, agriculture, and national identity that demonstrate the enduring power of indigenous traditions to adapt and survive despite centuries of colonialism and cultural suppression. The millions of people throughout Mexico and Central America who continue to speak natal and related languages maintain direct connections to the linguistic heritage of the Aztec Empire. While the agricultural techniques, craft traditions, and cultural practices that originated during the pre-conquest period continue to shape daily life in indigenous communities throughout the region. The scholarly study of Aztec civilization has contributed to broader understanding of complex societies, imperial administration, and cultural adaptation that informs contemporary discussions about governance, social organization, and environmental management. The sophisticated agricultural systems developed by Aztec farmers, particularly the Chinampa cultivation method, have attracted attention from modern agricultural researchers seeking sustainable approaches to food production in urban environments and challenging ecological conditions. The administrative innovations that enabled the Aztec Empire to govern diverse populations across vast territories provide valuable insights for contemporary political scientists and administrators grappling with similar challenges in multicultural societies. The tragic destruction of Aztec civilization during the Spanish conquest represents one of history's most dramatic examples of cultural collision and imperial expansion. While the survival and adaptation of indigenous traditions demonstrates the resilience of human societies confronting overwhelming challenges, the complex legacy of the Aztec Empire continues to influence contemporary Mexico and the broader world through its contributions to art, architecture, agriculture, and political thought, ensuring that this remarkable civilization remains a vital part of human cultural heritage despite the catastrophic heroic disruption of Spanish colonization. The ongoing archaeological investigation of Aztec sites, the preservation of indigenous languages and cultural practices, and the incorporation of pre-Columbian themes into contemporary art and politics demonstrate that the legacy of Tenochtitlan and its empire continues to shape human society more than 5 centuries after Cutomac's final defeat.